How does one measure the death of an age? Not in the tolling of a bell, nor in the dry scratch of a clerk's quill proclaiming a new king. No. It is measured in silence. A silence so profound it suffocates the very air in a room, a quiet that settles like dust on the vibrant tapestries of memory, dimming their brilliance. Here, in the chill-haunted chambers of Richmond Palace, in the winter of 1602, the silence had begun to grow. It crept from the Queen's private apartments, a cold mist seeping under doors and through the warp and weft of the court's whispered anxieties. And I, Philadelphia Scrope, had become its unwilling keeper. My station was Lady of the Bedchamber, a title that sounded grander than its reality. In truth, it meant I was a shadow among other shadows, a pair of hands to smooth a coverlet. A voice to read scripture until it became a meaningless drone, a presence to fill the void when solitude became too terrible a burden for a monarch to bear. For 44 years, she had been Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, a sun around which all of England revolved. Now, as she approached her 70th year, the sun was setting, and the cold was absolute. The decline had not been a sudden storm, but a slow, creeping frost. It had started, I think, with the loss of Essex. Not his betrayal, she was a monarch, hardened to the treason of ambitious men, but his death. The signing of that warrant had been the turning of a key in a lock deep within her soul, sealing away the last vestiges of warmth. In the year that followed, something in her had begun to unravel. Her brilliant mind was still a dagger, sharp and swift when she chose to wield it, but the hand that held it trembled. Tonight, the silence was particularly heavy. I stood near the hearth, where a fire fought a losing battle against the damp that clung to the stone walls. The Queen had not moved for what felt like hours. She was not seated on her throne-like chair, but stood, a pillar of black velvet and stiffened silk, her back to the room, her gaze fixed on the rain-lashed window. Her brilliant auburn wig, a fiery symbol of her undiminished power, seemed a cruel mockery atop a body that had grown so frail. She had refused her supper again, waving away the silver tray with a flick of her long, pale fingers, the gesture as imperious as ever, though it lacked its former strength. "Your Majesty," I began, my voice a small, foolish thing in the vast quiet. "The hour grows late. Will you not rest?" She did not turn. For a long moment, I thought she had not heard me, lost in whatever far country her thoughts now inhabited. Then, her voice came, not the commanding tone that could quell Parliament, but a thin, dry rustle, like dead leaves skittering across flagstones. "Rest, Scrope. And what is rest but a small death we practice for the Great One?" Her words hung in the air, a chilling prophecy. I had no answer for them. The other ladies, Eleanor and Mary, exchanged fearful glances from the far side of the room, their embroidery forgotten in their laps. We were all afraid. Not of her, not anymore. We were afraid for her. And we were afraid of what her end would mean. An England without Elizabeth was an idea too vast and terrifying to contemplate. For 2 generations, she was England. A quiet knock at the chamber door startled us all. It was Sir Robert Cecil, her Secretary of State, his small, stooped frame a familiar sight, his mind a web of political intrigue that stretched across the kingdom. He entered with a slight bow, his dark eyes taking in the scene with unnerving speed, the untouched tray, the standing Queen, the anxious ladies. Nothing escaped him. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice smooth and low. "A dispatch from the north. It requires your seal." He held out a roll of parchment. The Queen finally turned, her face a white mask of Venetian ceruse, the lead-based cosmetic she had used for decades to project an image of ageless purity. But now, the powder could not hide the fragility beneath, the fine web of wrinkles, the hollows at her temples. Her eyes, once so sharp and discerning, seemed clouded, as if looking through him. Through us all, at something far beyond. "The north can wait," she murmured, and turned back to the window. "The rain cannot." It was a dismissal, absolute and final. Cecil, the most powerful man in England besides the monarch herself, stood for a moment, the parchment still extended. I saw a flicker of frustration, or was it pity, in his eyes before he masked it? He bowed again, a model of deference. "As you wish, Majesty." He backed out of the room, his purpose thwarted. But I knew Cecil. He did not give up. The dispatch was a pretext. His true purpose was to gauge her fitness, to press, however gently, on the most dangerous and unspoken question in the realm: succession. For Elizabeth had no child, no direct heir. The Tudor line, which had pulled England from the chaos of civil war, would die with her. And she, in her magnificent, terrible pride, refused to name the one who would follow. To name a successor was to admit her own mortality, and that was a surrender she was not yet willing to make. As Cecil's footsteps faded down the corridor, I felt a new wave of dread. His visit was a sign. The world outside this chamber was growing impatient. The cogs of state were grinding, and they would not wait for a queen lost in grief. I looked at her still form, a silhouette against the stormy glass, and wondered what ghosts she saw in the swirling rain. Was it Essex, his handsome face marred by betrayal, walking to the scaffold? Or was it the long line of rivals and suitors she had outlived, their faces fading into the endless night of her long reign? "My lady," whispered Eleanor, her needle trembling. "She will catch a chill." I nodded. Moving forward again, my silk skirts rustling. "Your Majesty, please. A cushion by the fire. Let us bring you some warm wine." This time, she turned to face me fully. Her eyes fixed on mine, and for a terrifying second, I saw the old fire, the keen intelligence that had dazzled Europe. "Do you think me a child, Scrope? To be coaxed with cushions and wine?" Her voice was stronger, edged with ice. "I am the Queen. I will stand as long as I please." I curtsied low, my head bowed. "Forgive me, Majesty." "There is nothing to forgive," she said, her tone softening again into that weary rasp. "Only the turning of the year. The days grow shorter. That is all." But it was not all. We both knew it. The fire in the hearth was not the only thing that was dimming. The great fire of the Elizabethan age was guttering, and we, her loyal, helpless attendants, could only stand and watch as the shadows lengthened, threatening to swallow everything in their path. The days that followed blurred into a grim routine of watching and waiting. The Queen's refusal to eat became absolute. Broths, jellies, and possets were presented on silver trays and taken away untouched. Her body, already thin, began to retreat into itself, the bones of her face and hands becoming more prominent beneath her pale skin. The weight of her ornate gowns and heavy jewels seemed to crush her. Yet her vanity, that unshakable fortress, held firm. She still demanded her face be powdered into its porcelain mask each morning, her brilliant wigs set perfectly in place. The ritual of her appearance was the last bastion of control in a world that was slipping from her grasp. Her presence at court, once the very center of political and social life, ceased entirely. The music and pageantry that had defined her reign fell silent. Whitehall, her principal palace, was a hive of nervous activity, but here at Richmond, a funereal hush had descended. She no longer held council meetings, dismissing her ministers with a wave of her hand. Robert Cecil's visits became more frequent, his expression more strained. He would stand in the doorway, offering reports she would not hear, seeking a command she would not give. One afternoon, my brother, Robert Carey, sought me out in the corridors. His own ambition was a poorly kept secret at court, his eyes always scanning for advantage. He was a good man at his core, I believed, but the court was a place that rewarded the calculating over the kind. "Philadelphia," he said, his voice low and urgent, pulling me into a quiet alcove. "What news? They say she has not spoken a full sentence in 2 days." "The rumors are, as ever, exaggerated," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. The constant questioning felt like picking at a wound. "Her Majesty is melancholic." It was the word we had all agreed upon. A safe, Tudor diagnosis for a sorrow that ran too deep to name. Robert's eyes, so like my own, searched my face. Melancholy does not stop a monarch from naming her heir. Cecil is at his wit's end. The council is divided. There are factions forming, sister. Catholic whispers from the continent. If she dies without a clear word, the succession could be contested. We could see war. And what would you have me do? I snapped, my composure fraying. Forced the words from her throat. She is my queen. I am her servant, not her inquisitor. You are her most trusted lady, he pressed, his hand gripping my arm. She listens to you. You must find a moment. You must urge her. For the good of the realm. For our own good. Our fortunes are tied to a smooth transition. He meant the transition to James VI of Scotland, the son of the very cousin Elizabeth had executed. It was the logical choice, the one Cecil had been secretly engineering for years through coded letters. But without Elizabeth's explicit blessing, it was a hope, not a certainty. My duty is to her comfort, Robert. Not to the schemes of courtiers, I said, pulling my arm away. Is it a scheme to prevent bloodshed? He countered, his voice rising before he caught himself. He glanced around the empty corridor. Think, Philadelphia. Think of what is at stake. He left me then, his words hanging in the air like a bad omen. He was right, of course. The fate of a nation rested on the weary shoulders of the silent woman in the chamber. But when I returned to her room, and saw her standing by the window, so still and alone, her back to the world, I knew I could not do it. I could not add my voice to the chorus of demands that plagued her. My loyalty, in that moment, was not to the realm, not to my ambitious brother, but to the dying woman who had been the pole star of my entire life. That evening, something shifted. The Queen's long, silent vigils by the window took on a new, more terrifying dimension. She began to refuse sleep. It started subtly. When we urged her to her bed, she would shake her head, a small, stubborn gesture. She would allow us to place cushions on the floor, and she would sit stiffly upon them, her back straight, her eyes fixed on some invisible point in the middle distance. But she would not lie down. She would not close her eyes. The first night, we thought it a passing phase, a symptom of her deep unrest. By the third night, it had become a horrifying ritual. She would stand for hours, rooted to one spot, until her legs, swollen and trembling, could no longer support her. Then she would sink onto the cushions, but her eyes remained open, wide and staring, as if she were afraid of what she might see if she blinked. Dr. Brown, her physician, was summoned. He was a man of science, as much as Tudor medicine allowed, but he was baffled. He spoke of an imbalance of the humors, of a cold distemper of the brain. He offered tinctures and tonics, which she refused with a silent, contemptuous wave. Her Majesty must sleep, he insisted, his face grave. The body cannot endure without it. It is as essential as food or water. And how do you propose we make her? I asked, my patience worn thin by exhaustion and fear. Shall we hold her down? She is still the Queen. The doctor had no answer. None of us did. We took turns watching her, sitting in hushed silence through the long, dark hours. The palace around us slept, but in the Queen's chamber, there was no rest. There was only this endless, waking nightmare. At night, with only the flickering candlelight for company, the atmosphere grew thick with superstition. The maids whispered that the Queen feared sleep because it was the little death, and that if she surrendered to it, her soul might drift away and not return. They said she believed that to lie down was to invite death to take her. I dismissed their talk as folklore, but as the nights wore on, a sliver of that fear took root in my own heart. Her resistance was more than stubbornness. It felt primal, a desperate, last-ditch battle against the inevitable. She was not just a queen refusing to rest, she was a human soul standing watch over its own extinction, refusing to give the enemy an inch of ground. During one of these endless nights, as I sat on a stool near the door, my head heavy with fatigue, she spoke. Her voice was so soft I thought I had imagined it. Scrope. I was at her side in an instant. Yes, your majesty. She was still seated on the cushions, her eyes fixed on the embers of the dying fire. Did you ever see the masks at Kenilworth? The ones Leicester put on for me? So many years ago. The sudden, lucid memory was a shock. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, her great love, had been dead for over a decade. I was only a girl then, Majesty. But I remember the stories. They say it was the most magnificent pageant ever seen in England. A faint, ghostly smile touched her lips. It was. There was a garden of silver fountains, and fireworks that painted the stars with dragons and ships. He did it all for me. Her voice trailed off, and the smile vanished. He is gone. They are all gone. Walsingham, Burleigh, Leicester, even the boy. The boy. Essex. It always came back to him. Something has lodged itself in my heart, Scrope, she whispered, her gaze still on the fire. A shard of ice. He put it there. And it will not melt. Her hand, thin and almost translucent, came up to touch the heavy locket she always wore. I had never seen her open it. The court gossip swore it contained a miniature of Leicester. Others, more romantic, insisted it was Essex. I suspected it was empty, a symbol of a heart that had given itself to no one but England. He betrayed you. Majesty, I said gently, repeating the words the council had used, the words she herself had used to justify his end. He raised a rebellion against the crown. He was a fool, she breathed, a flicker of the old anger in her voice. An arrogant, impulsive fool. But he was my fool. She fell silent again, her confession, if that is what it was, complete. In that moment, she was not Gloriana. She was a tired, old woman, haunted by the ghost of a man she had loved and destroyed. The shard of ice in her heart was not just grief. It was guilt. The political pressure on her, and by extension, on us, her ladies, intensified. Robert Cecil's visits were no longer subtle. He began to speak plainly of the dangers of an uncertain succession. One morning, he cornered me outside the chapel, his face grim. Lady Scrope, this cannot continue. Her Majesty's life is in God's hands, but the life of the realm is in ours. She must be made to understand her duty. She understands her duty better than any man in this kingdom, Sir Robert, I retorted. She has lived it for 44 years. And she is undoing it all with this, silence. His voice was a sharp hiss. She has a visitor. A most important one. He gestured down the corridor. And I saw a man I did not recognize, though he was richly dressed, his face sharp and intelligent. With him was my brother, Robert. Who is that? I asked. An envoy. From the King of Scotland, Cecil said, his eyes boring into mine. He comes to offer his condolences for Her Majesty's ill health and his assurances of friendship. It was a diplomatic dance, a way for James to assert his presence without seeming to grasp for the crown. The Queen has refused to see him. She sees no one, I said flatly. She must see him. Or at the very least, you must carry a message to her. And bring back a reply. He was no longer asking. He was commanding. Tell her that her loyal council begs for a sign. A word. Even a gesture. A nod when his name is spoken. That is all we need to ensure a peaceful transfer of power. To honor the will we all know is hers. I felt trapped. My brother looked at me, his expression pleading. The stability of the nation, the future of my own family, all seemed to rest on this one moment. But the image of the Queen, haunted and frail, rose in my mind. To harry her with politics now felt like a violation, a final cruelty. I will tell her of the envoy's arrival, I said, my voice colder than I intended. I will not press her for an answer. Her Majesty's peace is my only concern. Cecil's lips thinned into a hard line. Her peace may be the death of us all, my lady. When I returned to the chamber, I found the queen in a state of agitation. The news of the Scottish envoy's arrival had already reached her, likely through a servant. She was pacing, a feat of endurance that seemed impossible for one so weak. "They circle like vultures," she spat, her voice thick with contempt. "The Scotsman sends his spies to measure me for my shroud." "He comes to offer good wishes, Majesty," I said, trying to soothe her. "He comes to see if I am dead yet," she cried, turning on me with a blaze of fury in her eyes. "And you? You are one of them. Your brother brings him to my very door. You all wish me gone." The accusation struck me like a physical blow. "Your Majesty. No. I am your loyal servant, to the last." "Loyalty?" She gave a short, bitter laugh. "I have seen what loyalty is worth. It is a coin that men spend to buy their own advancement." Essex swore loyalty. He kissed this hand and swore it, with tears in his eyes. A week later, he tried to seize my crown. She sank onto her cushions, the fire in her spent, leaving only exhaustion. "Leave me," she whispered. "All of you. Leave me be." We retreated to the antechamber, our hearts heavy with her anger and our own helplessness. We could hear her through the heavy oak door, not weeping, but muttering to herself, her voice rising and falling in a strange, disconnected cadence. The line between the monarch and the woman had dissolved completely. She was adrift on a sea of memory and paranoia, and we, on the shore, could do nothing but watch her drown. The days of her standing vigil finally came to a brutal end. Her strength, which had seemed supernatural, betrayed her at last. One afternoon, while her other ladies were taking a brief respite, I was alone with her. She was leaning against the wall, her eyes closed for a moment. I saw her body sway, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. Then, her knees buckled. She did not cry out, but crumpled to the floor in a heap of black velvet, as silent as a falling shadow. For a heart-stopping second, I was paralyzed by panic. Then I rushed to her side. "Your Majesty! Your Majesty, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open. There was no recognition in them, only a profound, bottomless weariness. She tried to push herself up, her pride warring with the utter failure of her body. "Help me," she breathed. The words a surrender, the first she had made. My own strength was not enough to lift her. I called for the guards outside the door, my voice choked with alarm. Two burly yeomen entered, their faces a mixture of awe and terror at being summoned into the Queen's private agony. With the utmost care, as if handling a piece of priceless, fragile glass, we lifted her to her bed, I commanded. It was the first time she had touched it in what felt like weeks. As we laid her down upon the silken sheets, a collective sigh seemed to pass through the room. It was a moment of both tragedy and relief. The long, terrible watch was over. But we all knew it signified the beginning of the end. She was placed gently beneath the heavy velvet coverlets, a fragile relic being lowered into its final resting place. The moment her head touched the pillow, her eyes closed. And she fell into a sleep so deep it seemed almost indistinguishable from death itself. Dr. Brown was summoned immediately. He examined her as best he could, though even in her stupor, a lifetime of modesty made her resist his touch. He noted the shallow, irregular rhythm of her breathing, the faint, thready pulse at her wrist. "She is exhausted," he stated, his voice low and grave. "Her body has consumed itself. All we can do now is wait. Keep her warm. Offer her sips of water, if she can take it." He looked at me, his professional demeanor cracking for a moment to reveal a deep sadness. "Pray, my lady. It is all that is left to us." As the news of her collapse spread through the palace, the atmosphere transformed. The whispers ceased, replaced by a sacred, heavy silence. Courtiers who had paced anxiously outside her door now stood still, their faces etched with a dawning grief. This was no longer a political crisis to be managed. This was the death of a titan. Cecil arrived, his usual briskness replaced by a somber gravity. He stood at the foot of the bed, gazing at the small, still form of the woman who had dominated his entire political life. He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw the question he no longer needed to ask. There would be no sign. No word. No gesture. The great orator, the queen whose speeches could rouse armies, would pass into history without a final declaration. My brother, Robert, came to me, his face pale. All his ambition seemed to have drained away, leaving only a raw, familial concern. Philadelphia, is she? She is breathing, I whispered. That is all I can say. He took my hand, his grip tight. The council will meet. They will proclaim James on their own authority once it is done. Cecil has prepared the document. He hesitated. I will be the one to ride to Scotland. I must be the first to bring the news to the new king. It was not a boast, but a statement of grim reality. His career, his future, depended on that ride. I looked from my exhausted brother to the dying queen and felt my loyalties tear me in two. There is a ring, I said, the words coming to me in a sudden, clear thought. The blue sapphire she sometimes wears. The one James's mother sent her, years ago, as a token of peace. It was a lie, of course. Mary, Queen of Scots, had sent no such token. But the story would serve. When the time comes, I will drop it from the north window. It will be your signal. Ride then. Ride and do not look back. It was a treasonous act, in a way. An agreement to signal the end of my queen before her own council had made it public. But it was also an act of love for my brother, and perhaps, a final service to the realm, ensuring the news traveled swiftly and without confusion. He nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude, and squeezed my hand before retreating. I returned to my vigil at the bedside. The room was dim, lit only by a few candles that cast long, dancing shadows on the tapestries. Outside, the world held its breath. The ladies took turns sitting with me, our presence a silent, final honor guard. Lady Scrope, her face a mask of sorrow, held the queen's hand, occasionally dabbing her brow with a cloth soaked in rosewater. I watched the faint rise and fall of her chest. Her skin, which had been so unnaturally white with makeup, now took on a pale, ashen hue in the candlelight. The mask was gone. The years of powder and paint had been stripped away by the harsh reality of death, leaving behind the face of a very old, very tired woman. A woman who had carried a kingdom on her shoulders and was now, at last, laying her burden down. My mind drifted back through the years. I saw her as a young queen, her red gold hair shining, her laughter echoing through the halls of Hampton Court. I saw her on her barge on the Thames, witty and brilliant, trading barbs with foreign ambassadors and charming them into submission. I saw her at Tilbury, clad in silver armor, her voice ringing out across the fields as she addressed her troops, ready to face the Spanish Armada. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, she had cried, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. And she did. She had ruled like a king, thought like a king, and sacrificed like a king. She had sacrificed marriage, children, and perhaps her own personal happiness, for the sake of her people and her crown. She had been mother, father, and sovereign to them all. And in return, she had their devotion, their fear, and their love. But she had died, as she had lived, profoundly alone. The hours crawled by. The candles burned low, their wax pooling like tears. The breathing from the bed grew shallower, with long, unnerving pauses in between. Each pause stretched into an eternity. We held our breath with her, waiting for the next. Then, just as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the heavy curtains, there was a pause that did not end. The room remained utterly still. The silence was absolute. I watched her chest, praying for it to move one last time. It did not. The fire had gone out. Lady Scrope, with a soft, choked sob, gently pulled the linen sheet up and over the queen's face. It was over. Elizabeth I, by the grace of God, Queen of England, France and Ireland, defender of the faith, was dead. For a full minute, no one moved. We stood like statues, frozen in the sacred, terrible finality of the moment. We were no longer ladies of the court. We were simply women grieving the loss of our mistress. Then, the weight of what had to be done settled upon us. While Lady Scrope and the others began to whisper psalms, their voices trembling, I moved to the north window. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the latch. The cold morning air hit my face, a shocking reminder that the world outside this room of death was still alive, still turning. I pulled the blue sapphire ring from my finger, my own ring, not the Queen's, but it would serve the story, and looked down into the courtyard below. My brother, Robert, was there, a dark shape beside a saddled horse, already cloaked for his journey. He was looking up, his face a pale oval in the dim light. Our eyes met across the distance. I held up the ring, letting the faint dawn light catch its facets. Then, I let it fall. It tumbled through the air, a tiny spark of blue against the gray stone, and he caught it. He didn't wave. He didn't look up again. He simply mounted his horse. And with a clatter of hooves that echoed unnaturally loud in the quiet dawn, he was gone, riding north to proclaim a new king. I closed the window, shutting out the sound of the future. I turned back to the bed, to the still form under the sheet. My treason was done. My duty was done. I had served my queen in life, and I had served my family, and perhaps the realm, in the moment of her death. Robert Cecil entered the room. His face composed, but his eyes heavy with the weight of history. He did not need to be told. He knew. The council is assembled at Whitehall, he said quietly to no one in particular. A proclamation has been drawn. He was the spider at the center of the web, and even in his grief, he was spinning. The transition he had worked for, prayed for, was at hand. England would not be left rudderless. The Tudor dynasty was over. But the kingdom would endure. That, perhaps, was Elizabeth's true, final victory. A victory she had achieved through a lifetime of strength, not through a single, dying word. As the official pronouncements began and the court machinery clanked into motion, preparing for a royal funeral and the arrival of a new monarch, I remained in the chamber. The other ladies came and went, their faces tear-streaked. Servants tiptoed in to change the candles. But I stayed. I felt a need to guard this final silence, to protect the memory of the woman who lay there, no longer a queen, but simply Elizabeth. The mask had slipped away. The powder and paint, the wigs and gowns, the carefully constructed edifice of Gloriana, had all fallen. What remained was a small, frail woman who had borne the weight of a nation and been broken. Not by her enemies, but by time and sorrow. They would write of her for centuries. They would speak of her victories, her wisdom, her legendary resolve. They would call her age golden. But I would remember the silence. I would remember the woman who stood alone by a rain-lashed window, staring at ghosts. I would remember the shard of ice in her heart. And I would remember the profound, aching quiet of the room where an entire age had drawn its last, shuddering breath. The tolling of the bells for King James I would soon begin, but for now, in this room, Elizabeth's silence still reigned, a final, unbending act of a will that had shaped the world. Story 2. Does the earth remember? Does the packed loss of Shangxi, yellow and unforgiving, hold in its heart the memory of the hands that shaped it, the sweat that salted it, the blood that stained it? Does it recall the sound of 1,000 chisels singing a song of forced creation, or the silence of 1,000,000 breaths held in fear? We walk upon it, build our homes upon it, dig our wells into its depths, and imagine it is merely dirt, forgetful and inert. We are wrong. The earth never forgets. The first thing Wei noticed was the dust. It was not the gentle, honest dust of the fields back home in his village. A dust that smelled of millet and turned to nourishing mud with the rains. This was a dead dust, a pulverized earth raised by the shuffling feet of 10,000 men and the ceaseless turning of cartwheels. It was a shroud that hung in the air, thick and yellow, catching in the back of the throat and turning every swallow to grit. It coated the tongue, filmed the eyes, and settled deep into the grain of his tunic, a permanent stain of servitude. He had been walking for 3 weeks, part of a long, shuffling column of conscripts that snaked across the province like a wounded serpent. They were farmers, potters, blacksmiths, and weavers, men whose hands were skilled in the arts of life, now marching toward a project that glorified only death. The emperor, Qin Shi Huang, the unifier of all under heaven, sought to defy it. And so, they marched. Wei was a sculptor. His hands, calloused but nimble, knew the language of clay. He could coax a smile onto the face of a stern elder, capture the mischief in a child's eyes, or shape the graceful curve of a dancer's arm. In his small village, his work was life. He crafted bowls that would hold a family's meal, good luck charms for newborns, and the intricate eaves tiles that kept the rain from his neighbors' heads. His greatest work, a gift for his betrothed, Enli, was a small, delicate statue of a phoenix, its wings poised for flight, its clay body so light it seemed to breathe. He had presented it to her on the eve of his departure, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight as her fingers traced its feathers. "It will wait for you," she had whispered, her voice tight with unshed tears. "It will not fly away until you return." He clung to that memory now as the column crested a final, barren hill. Below them, the world fell away into a man-made valley of impossible scale. It was a scar upon the earth, a vast, sprawling complex of pits and workshops, kilns and barracks, all swarming with a legion of laborers who moved like ants under the harsh sun. The air, already thick with dust, was now heavy with the smell of wood smoke from hundreds of kilns, the sharp tang of sweat, and something else. Something acrid and metallic, fear. This was the emperor's final vanity. His necropolis. His underworld palace where he would continue to rule long after his mortal body had surrendered to the worms. And they, this column of conscripts, were the latest resource to be consumed by its creation. A guard with a face like a knotted root shoved way forward. "Move. The overseer does not like to be kept waiting." They were herded into a wide, open square where a man stood upon a raised wooden platform. He was not tall, but he commanded the space around him as if he were a giant. He wore a simple bronze helmet and leather armor, but his authority was not in his attire. It was in his stillness. While thousands toiled around him, he stood unmoving, his eyes sweeping over the new arrivals with a cold, dispassionate gaze that weighed and measured each man. This was Supervisor Tan. "You are here for one purpose," Tan's voice cut through the dust-choked air, sharp and clear. "You are here to serve the eternal glory of the first emperor, blessed be his name. You are no longer farmers or potters. You have no names but the numbers that will be assigned to you. You have no family but the legion of your fellow workers. You have no will but the will of the emperor. Which is my will." He paused, letting the silence press down on them. "Your old lives are forgotten. Your new life is work. You will work from the first light of dawn until the last light of dusk. You will eat what you are given. You will sleep where you are told. The rules are simple. Obey, and you will live to work another day. Disobey." He let the word hang in the air, then gestured with one hand toward a series of wooden cages near the edge of the square. Inside, skeletal figures slumped in the heat, their eyes hollow. "And you will serve as a reminder to others." Wei felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was not creation. This was a slow, grinding death. Over the next few days, Wei learned the rhythm of this new existence. He was stripped of his name and became Worker 734. He was assigned to a long, low barracks with hundreds of other men. The air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and despair. The food was a thin gruel of millet and water, barely enough to quell the gnawing hunger in his belly. The work was brutal. His first assignment was in the clay pits, digging the raw loess from the earth, his sculptor's hands raw and bleeding from the rough spade. He worked until his back screamed in protest and his mind was a dull, aching void. filled only with the rhythmic thud of his tool against the unforgiving ground. He watched men collapse from heat and exhaustion, only to be dragged away by guards, their fate unknown and unmourned. He saw a man whipped for spilling a bucket of water. He learned that the only currency here was silence and obedience. He kept his head down, hoarded the image of Enli and her phoenix in his heart, and worked. But his hands remembered. Even as he dug, his fingers would unconsciously shape the clods of earth, finding a curve that suggested a cheekbone, a line that hinted at a jaw. It was a reflex, an instinct he could not suppress. It was this instinct that undid him, and saved him. One evening, as he was hauling a basket of raw clay toward the mixing pools, Supervisor Tan appeared at his side, as silent as a shadow. Wei froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Tan did not look at him. He looked at the basket. "Your hands," he said, his voice low. Wei looked down. His hands were caked in mud, the knuckles split and bloody. "You are a potter?" Tan asked. "A sculptor, honored supervisor," Wei managed to say, his voice a dry rasp. Tan reached into the basket and picked up a lump of clay. He turned it over in his palm, his thumb tracing a smooth indentation Wei had made without thinking. For a long moment, he was silent. Wei prepared himself for the whip, for the cage. "The face workshops are behind schedule," Tan said, still not looking at him. "We have an abundance of torsos and legs, but the master artisans complain of a shortage of heads. They say the conscripts assigned to them have hands like stone mallets. They produce dolls, not men." He finally turned his gaze to Wei, and his eyes were like chips of obsidian. "Follow me, 734. You will show me if your hands remember more than how to hold a spade." Wei's heart leaped with a terrifying mixture of hope and fear. To be taken from the pits was a reprieve from a slow death. But to be placed under the direct scrutiny of Supervisor Tan was to walk a razor's edge. He was led away from the sprawling, chaotic outer workshops to a series of long, covered pavilions at the heart of the complex. Here, the air was different. The raw smell of earth was mixed with the clean scent of wet clay. The noise was not of digging and hauling, but of scraping, smoothing, and 1,000 tiny, focused sounds of creation. Inside the nearest pavilion, an army was being born. Rows upon rows of life-sized figures stood in silent ranks. Some were complete, their armored torsos and sturdy legs awaiting only their heads. Others were disembodied parts, piles of arms, stacks of legs, hollow chests, all organized with chilling efficiency. Master artisans, their faces grim with concentration, moved among the figures, assembling them like grotesque puzzles. And at the far end of the pavilion was the workshop of faces. Here, a dozen men sat on low stools, each before a lump of wet, gray clay on a pedestal. They were the sculptors. Their task was the most delicate, the most crucial. For the emperor had decreed that his eternal guard would not be an army of identical dolls. Each soldier was to be an individual. Each face unique. They were to be a perfect, silent mirror of his living army, a legion of distinct souls bound to his eternal service. Tan led Wei to an empty stool and a fresh block of clay. "The emperor requires a kneeling archer," he said. His voice a low command. He should be young, focused, his eyes on the enemy, his expression one of calm readiness before the moment of release. "We have 1,000 archers. His face must not be one of them. Now, work. I will return at moonrise." He turned and left without another word. Wei was alone, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The other sculptors did not look up. Their own survival depended on ignoring everything but the clay before them. Wei looked at his hands. They were trembling. The cuts and calluses from the pits felt alien. He took a deep breath, the scent of the clay filling his lungs. It smelled like home. He closed his eyes and pictured Enli. He pictured his village. He thought of the faces he knew, the stern village elder, the boastful blacksmith, his own father's face, lined with worry. Then he reached out and touched the clay. It was cool and yielding. His fingers sank into it, and for the first time in weeks, his hands did not feel pain. They felt alive. The trembling stopped. The fear receded, replaced by a deep, instinctual focus. He was no longer worker 734. He was Wei, the sculptor. He began to work. He did not think. He let his hands remember. He built up the broad planes of the face, the strong jaw, the curve of the skull. He hollowed the sockets for the eyes, shaped the bridge of the nose. He let the image of a young man from a neighboring village, a boy who had been a gifted hunter, guide his fingers. He remembered the boy's quiet confidence, the way he would still his breath before letting an arrow fly. He worked through the fading light of day, oblivious to the sounds around him. The clay became a living thing under his touch. He shaped the subtle flare of the nostrils. The gentle curve of the lips, parted slightly as if in breath. He used a fine bamboo tool to incise the individual strands of hair, pulling them back into the tight, practical topknot of an archer. He paid attention to the ears, ensuring the lobes were different, one slightly thicker than the other, as is true of all men. It was the eyes that held the greatest challenge. They had to be open but not staring, focused but not fearful. They had to hold the calm intensity of a warrior who had accepted his duty and his fate. Wei hollowed them carefully, then, with a touch so delicate it was barely a caress, he shaped the eyelids and the suggestion of a pupil. He did not carve a hole, but an illusion of depth, a shadow that seemed to gaze back at him. When he was done, he sat back, his body aching, his throat parched. Before him was not a lump of clay. It was a face. A young man, barely 20, frozen in a moment of perfect, deadly concentration. He was alive. The shadow of Supervisor Tan fell over him. Wei had not heard him approach. Tan stood for a long time, his eyes fixed on the sculpted head. He circled it slowly, his gaze missing nothing. He noted the asymmetry of the ears, the faint scar Wei had instinctively added to the chin. The tension in the muscles of the neck. The other sculptors had stopped working. The pavilion was silent save for the distant crackle of a kiln. Tan reached out a single, blunt finger and gently touched the clay cheek. "You have made a soldier," he said, his voice a low whisper that was more chilling than a shout. He turned to the foreman of the workshop. "This one, 734, will work here from now on. Give him the tools he requires. His quota is 3 faces per week. Each one must be of this quality. Each one must be different." He looked back at Wei, and for a fleeting instant, Wei thought he saw something other than cold command in the supervisor's eyes. It might have been respect. Or it might have been the look a man gives a fine, new tool he has just acquired. "Do not disappoint me, 734, Tan said. "The Emperor's eternity is being built on our precision. Any flaw, any crack, any imperfection, is treason." The promotion was a reprieve, but Wei soon learned it was a different kind of prison. He was given better food, a pallet closer to the workshop, and a set of fine bamboo and bone tools. But the pressure was immense. 3 unique faces a week. 3 souls summoned from the grey clay, each one destined to stand guard in the silent dark for 10,000 years. He sculpted infantrymen with broad, determined jaws. He crafted charioteers with arrogant, windswept hair. He made officers with stern, knowing eyes that had seen 100 battles. He drew on the memories of every face he had ever known, twisting and combining features, aging them, softening them, hardening them. He became a god of a small, clay universe, birthing men who would never breathe. His workshop neighbor was an old man named Bao. He was stooped and frail, his hands gnarled with age, but they moved with a slow, deliberate grace. Bao had been here for a decade. He had sculpted hundreds of faces, and his eyes held a deep, weary sadness. "You have the gift, boy," Bao rasped one evening, after watching Wei finish the face of a grim-faced general. "There is life in your work. Be careful. Life is a dangerous thing in this place." "I only do what I am told," Wei replied. keeping his eyes on his work. To make them seem real. There is real, and there is too real, Bao said, his voice barely a whisper. Tan watches you. He sees the spirit in your soldiers. Spirit is another word for defiance. Here, a man should be a tool, nothing more. A tool does not have a spirit. Wei understood the old man's warning. He had noticed Tan's lingering inspections. The supervisor would often stand behind him for long periods. His silence more unnerving than any command. Wei knew he was being tested, his skill both an asset and a liability. But he could not help it. The act of creation was the only part of his old life he had left. It was his only connection to the man he had been. To sculpt a lifeless doll would be to admit that he, too, was dead inside. And so, he poured his skill, his memory, and his grief into the clay. The grief was a constant, dull ache in his chest. Grief for his lost freedom, for Enli, for the life that had been stolen from him. But most of all, he grieved for his younger brother, Fun. Fun had been 14, clever and quick-witted, but with a rebellious tongue. A year before Wei was taken, Fun had spoken out against a new tax levy in the marketplace. He had called the emperor's magistrate a greedy thief. For that, for a few angry words, he had been taken by the guards. They had beaten him, and he had died from his injuries a week later. The official cause was a wasting sickness. Everyone in the village knew the truth. The injustice of it burned in Wei's memory. An emperor who sought eternal life had so casually extinguished the short, bright life of his brother. The idea came to him slowly, a dangerous seed planted in the fertile ground of his sorrow. It was a madness born of powerlessness. He was a maker of faces for the emperor's silent army. What if one of those faces was not a stranger? What if one of those soldiers, standing guard for eternity, were the face of the boy the emperor had murdered? It would be his secret. His tribute. His act of defiance, hidden in plain sight. A single, remembered face in a legion of thousands, a silent testament to a life that had mattered. He knew the risk was absolute. If he were discovered, it would not be the whip or the cage. It would be a slow, inventive death designed to be a lesson to all. But the more he thought about it, the more the risk seemed to matter less. His body was a slave to the emperor, but his memory, his art, his soul, those were still his own. He decided to do it. He chose his moment carefully. A new order had come down for a company of young standard-bearers. Figures of honor and pride. The work was high-profile. Tan would be watching. That made it both more dangerous and more fitting. He began the head as he always did, shaping the basic structure. But this time, he was not drawing on a composite of memories. He was drawing on a single, beloved image. He summoned his brother's face from the depths of his heart. He remembered Fun's high cheekbones, the slight cleft in his chin. The way his left eyebrow always arched higher than his right when he was amused. Under Wei's hands, Fun's face emerged from the clay. It was an act of agonizing love. Every curve and plane was a memory. He worked with a fierce, tender concentration that bordered on prayer. He was not just sculpting clay. He was resurrecting a ghost. He gave the face a serene, proud expression. This was not Fun the victim, but Fun the defiant soul, a standard-bearer for all the nameless dead who had built this necropolis. Bao watched him from his stool, his old eyes filled with alarm. He saw the intensity in Wei's work, the personal connection that radiated from the sculpture. Several times, he seemed about to speak, to warn him, but he held his tongue, merely shaking his head with a slow, sorrowful motion. As Wei added the final, delicate touches to the hair, another idea, even more reckless, bloomed in his mind. A face was a secret that could be denied. It could be claimed as a coincidence, a trick of the imagination. He wanted more. He wanted to leave a mark that was undeniable, a signature of his grief. He took up a fine, sharp-boned stylus. While the head was still on its pedestal, he looked around the workshop. The foreman was at the far end. And Tan was not in sight. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, he reached inside the hollow neck of the sculpture. On the inner wall of the chest cavity, a place that would be sealed and hidden forever once the head was attached, he carved a single, small character. It was the character for remember. Wang. It was his secret, whispered into the heart of a clay soldier. A prayer for remembrance in an empire built on forced forgetting. He finished the head. It was his masterpiece. It was not just clay, it was love and rage and sorrow given form. It was his brother, whole and unbowed, ready to take his place in the Emperor's eternal legion. He set it aside with the other completed heads, his heart a wild bird in his chest. For 2 days, nothing happened. The head was taken by the assemblers and attached to the body of a standard-bearer. The figure was fired in the great kiln, its grey clay turning to a hard, reddish terracotta. It was then moved to the painting pavilion, where artisans would give it the colors of life, a lacquered armor, a brightly painted tunic, and skin of a living hue. Wei tried to lose himself in his work, to sculpt other, anonymous faces. But his eyes kept straying to the painting pavilion. He felt a terrible, magnetic pull toward his creation. It was Bao who brought the news. "They are painting your standard-bearer," he murmured, not looking at Wei. "The master painter himself is doing it. He says he has never seen a face with such life. He wants to present it to Supervisor Tan as an example of the workshop's finest work." Wei's blood ran cold. The finest work. To be presented to Tan. The face would be inspected with a closeness he had not anticipated. "It is just a face. Old friend," Wei said, his voice tight. "One among thousands." "Is it?" Bao looked at him then, his eyes deep with a sorrowful wisdom. "You have put your soul into that clay, boy. I pray Tan does not see it." The summons came the next afternoon. A guard appeared at Wei's workstation. "Supervisor Tan requires your presence." In the main inspection hall. Wei's tools clattered from his numb fingers. Bao placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Be strong, son. And be silent." The inspection hall was a vast, covered courtyard where the most complete figures were brought for final approval before being moved to the pits. In the center of the hall, standing alone on a low dais, was the standard-bearer. It was magnificent. The painters had done their work with exquisite skill. The armor shone with black lacquer, its rivets picked out in red. The tunic was a vibrant purple, the color of royalty. And the face was breathtaking. They had given it the flush of life, the dark pigment of the eyes so skillfully applied that they seemed to hold a deep, liquid intelligence. It was fun. It was his brother, more alive in death than Wei had ever managed to make him in clay. Supervisor Tan stood before the statue, his hands clasped behind his back. Next to him stood the master painter, beaming with pride. "Remarkable, is it not, Supervisor?" the painter said. "The spirit of the Emperor's army captured in a single face. This sculptor, 734, is a true master." Tan did not answer. He continued to stare at the face, his expression unreadable. Wei's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. He felt the gazes of the guards, the painter, the other foremen who had been gathered to witness this presentation. "It is a fine piece of work," Tan said finally, his voice flat. "The craftsmanship is flawless." He took a step closer, leaning in until his own face was only inches from the terracotta one. He examined the eyes, the line of the jaw, the subtle curve of the lips. There is a familiarity to it. A defiance. The expression is proud. Too proud for a mere soldier who serves. "It is the pride of serving the Emperor, surely," the painter offered, his smile faltering slightly. "Perhaps," Tan said. He turned his head and his cold eyes locked onto Wei's. "Step forward, 734. Wei's legs felt like stone, but he willed them to move. He walked across the paved floor and stopped a few feet from the dais, his eyes fixed on the ground. "You are the sculptor of this face?" Tan asked. Yes, honored supervisor. It is a good likeness. Who is he? The question was a thunderclap in the silent hall. Wei's mind raced. He could lie. He could say it was no one, just a face from his imagination. But looking at the statue, at his brother's proud, serene expression, the lie caught in his throat. To deny him now would be the final betrayal. He was my brother, Wei whispered, the words tasting of ash. A collective gasp went through the assembled men. The master painter went pale. Supervisor Tan's expression did not change. It was as if he had expected this answer. Your brother, he said softly. And what became of this brother, who had such a proud face? Wei's courage deserted him. He could not speak. He could only stare at the stone floor, his body trembling. It was Bao who spoke. The old sculptor shuffled forward from the crowd, his face a mask of desperation. Honored supervisor, forgive the boy's foolishness. He is young. His grief has clouded his judgment. The face is a tribute to a loyal soldier of the emperor, a man from his village who died bravely in the unification wars. The boy misspoke from sorrow. Tan turned his cold gaze on Bao. Old man, he said, his voice dripping with venom. Loyalty is a fine quality. Misplaced loyalty is a disease. I will deal with you later. He looked back at Wei. I ask you again. 734, how did your brother die? Wei lifted his head, and his eyes met Tan's. He no longer saw a way out. He only saw his brother's face, so full of life. The fear fell away, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. He was killed, Wei said, his voice clear and steady. For speaking the truth. The silence in the hall was absolute. It was as if the air itself had frozen. Tan held Wei's gaze for a long moment. Then a slow, terrible smile spread across his lips. It was a smile of triumph. I thought so, he said. A rebellious spirit. It shines from his eyes. It shines from yours. He gestured to the guards. Seize him. As the guards grabbed his arms, Wei looked past Tan to the statue. He saw his brother's face, proud and eternal. He had not failed him. You are a fool, 734, Tan said, his voice conversational. You thought you could hide your little treason in my army. You thought you could mock the emperor with a statue. He walked over to the standard bearer and ran a hand over its smooth, painted surface. It is a pity. The craftsmanship truly is excellent. Then, he turned to a guard. Bring me a sledgehammer. A heavy, iron-headed hammer was brought forward. Tan took it in his hands, testing its weight. He looked at Wei, his eyes glittering with a cold fire. Treason must be erased. Memory must be corrected. He raised the sledgehammer high. Wei cried out, a raw, wordless sound of protest. Watch, sculptor, Tan commanded. Watch how easily a memory can be broken. With a grunt of effort, he swung the hammer. It connected with the head of the statue with a sickening crack. The beautiful face, his brother's face, shattered into 100 pieces, the painted terracotta exploding like a burst melon. The proud standard-bearer was now a headless corpse of clay. Wei fell to his knees, a sob tearing from his throat. The guards held him fast. Tan let the hammer fall to the floor with a clang. He looked down at the shards of painted clay at his feet. Then he looked at Wei. His smile was gone, replaced by a look of utter contempt. But the crime is not just in the face. Is it? He said softly. He knelt and picked up a large fragment of the shattered neck. He turned it over and his finger traced a shape on the inner surface. He held it up for Wei to see. It was the place where he had carved his secret. The character Wang. Remember. You see. Tan said to the horrified onlookers. The poison was not just on the surface. It was in the heart. He threw the fragment down. Take him to the punishment cells. Let him contemplate his memory. Tomorrow, we will make a new lesson for the camp. A lesson on the virtue of forgetting. As they dragged him away, Wei saw Bao being pulled from the crowd by 2 other guards. The old man looked at him, his face filled not with anger, but with a profound, heartbreaking pity. The punishment cell was a pit of darkness, damp and cold. It smelled of mildew and despair. Wei was thrown onto the wet stone floor, the heavy wooden door booming shut behind him, plunging him into absolute blackness. There was no light, no sound but the drip of water somewhere in the darkness and the frantic beating of his own heart. He curled into a ball, his body shaking uncontrollably. The image of his brother's face shattering replayed in his mind, over and over. He had not saved Fun. He had only gotten him killed a second time. And he had doomed Bao. The old man's warning echoed in his ears. Life is a dangerous thing in this place. He had been a fool, a proud, arrogant fool. His small act of defiance had achieved nothing but more death, more suffering. He wept. He wept for his brother, for Bao, for Enli, whom he would never see again. He wept for himself, for the boy who had loved to shape clay and who would now die in this forgotten hole. The darkness pressed in, suffocating him. This was the true face of the Emperor's eternity, a lightless void. He did not know how long he lay there. Time ceased to have meaning. It could have been hours or days. The darkness was a physical weight, and his grief was a bottomless ocean. He drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, haunted by dreams of shattering faces and the cold, triumphant smile of Supervisor Tan. At some point, a small wooden bowl of water was shoved through a slot at the bottom of the door. He crawled toward it, his throat raw, and drank the stale, tepid liquid. It was a sign he was being kept alive. Kept for the public lesson Tan had promised. He imagined the horrors that awaited him, the slow slicing, the breaking of bones, a death designed for maximum spectacle. And a part of him welcomed it. It would be an end to the guilt that was consuming him. He was in that pit of despair when the sound began. At first, it was a low, distant rumble, a vibration he felt through the stone floor more than heard with his ears. He thought it was an earth tremor. But it grew steadily louder, resolving into a roar of human voices. It was a sound of chaos, of thousands of men shouting not in unison, but in a wild, anarchic chorus of rage. The sound of a dam breaking. Closer, he heard shouts, screams, the clash of metal on metal. The ground shook with the running of thousands of feet. The rebellion had come. He had heard whispers of it for months, dismissed as the foolish dreams of desperate men. Whispers of a usurper prince, of armies massing in the east, of the emperor's own health failing from the mercury elixirs he so faithfully drank. No one had believed it. The emperor was eternal. His rule was absolute. But the sound outside was the sound of the absolute breaking apart. A tremendous crash echoed down the corridor, followed by the splintering of wood. The shouts were closer now, angrier. He heard a voice he recognized, one of the guards, cry out in pain, a cry that was abruptly silenced. Wei pushed himself up, pressing his ear against the cold, damp wood of his cell door. The sounds of fighting were right outside. He heard a heavy body slump against the door. Then, a splintering crack as a heavy bar was slammed against it. Once. Twice. On the third blow, the lock gave way and the door swung inward with a groan. A sliver of light from a waving torch cut through the darkness. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, his face smeared with dirt and blood, a stolen guard sword in his hand. He was a laborer from the kills, a man Wei recognized but did not know. The man peered into the darkness. "Anyone in here?" he yelled. His voice hoarse with adrenaline. Wei could not speak. He could only stare, blinking against the unaccustomed light. "The Emperor is dead," the man shouted, a wild, joyful grin splitting his face. "Supervisor Tan is dead. We are free." He raised his sword in triumph. "The Qin have fallen. Burn it all. Burn this whole cursed place to the ground." He did not wait for a reply, turning and running down the corridor. His shouts swallowed by the greater roar outside. "The Emperor is dead." The words barely registered. Wei staggered out of the cell into the torchlit corridor. It was a scene of carnage. The bodies of several guards lay sprawled on the stones. Further down, he saw a group of laborers trying to break open the workshop supply rooms, looking for weapons or anything of value. He was free. The realization was a shock that left him numb. He was not going to be executed. Tan was dead. The entire world had been turned upside down while he had been weeping in the dark. He stumbled out of the prison block into the night air. The sky was not dark. It was a hellish orange, lit by the flames of a dozen burning buildings. The great workshops, the barracks, the administrative pavilions, all were being put to the torch. The vast, orderly necropolis had descended into a maelstrom of violent, cathartic destruction. Men were running everywhere, some carrying looted goods, others simply running, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and this place of their enslavement. Wei saw a group of rebels, armed with stolen spears and sharpened tools, swarming toward the painting pavilions, their faces illuminated by the firelight, their expressions contorted with a furious joy. They were going to destroy the army. They were going to smash every last clay soldier, erasing the last vestiges of the tyrant who had stolen their lives. A part of him wanted to join them, to add his own rage to the fire, to shatter the clay limbs and headless torsos. But he found he could not. His own creation, the proud standard-bearer, was already dust. His tribute was gone. His secret was safe. His thoughts turned to Bao. Had the old man survived? In the chaos, there was no way to know. He was likely another casualty, another ghost in this haunted place. The weight of that possibility settled on him, a sorrow too deep for the surrounding chaos to touch. He knew he had to leave. To stay was to risk being killed in the indiscriminate violence or being caught by whatever forces might come to restore order. He turned away from the burning heart of the camp and began to move toward the outer darkness, keeping to the shadows. As he passed the entrance to one of the great, unfinished pits, Pit 1, he paused. The roof of the massive structure was already on fire, thick black smoke pouring into the night sky. For a moment, he was tempted to look inside, to see the thousands of soldiers standing in their silent ranks, awaiting the flames. He wanted to see the legion of faces he had sculpted, the anonymous men who would now receive a fiery burial. But he stopped himself. That part of his life was over. Those faces were not his. They belonged to the Emperor, to the earth, to the fire. He turned his back on the burning effigy of the Empire and melted into the darkness, just another nameless man escaping the fall of a dynasty. He did not look back. He had a promise to keep. He had a phoenix to return to. The journey home was a blur of hunger, fear, and relentless walking. The entire province was in turmoil. The emperor's death had shattered the iron grip of the Qin, and local warlords, bandits, and rebel factions rose to fill the vacuum. Law was a memory. Wei traveled by night, stealing food from fields, sleeping in ditches, avoiding roads and towns. He was no longer Worker 734. He was a ghost, a refugee in his own land. His sculptor's hands, once capable of such delicate work, were now skilled in the art of survival. He learned to read the stars, to find clean water, to move without a sound. The memory of the necropolis was a brand on his soul, but the hope of seeing Enli again was a lodestone pulling him north. After 2 months of walking, he stumbled into the familiar fields of his own village. It was a ghost of what he remembered. Many of the homes were deserted, the fields untended. The years of harsh conscription and crippling taxes had taken their toll. But it was home. He went to Enli's house, his heart a frantic drum. He found her in the small courtyard, tending a meager vegetable patch. She looked up as his shadow fell over her. Her eyes widened. She was thinner, her face etched with worry, but it was her. She did not speak his name. She simply dropped the trowel she was holding and ran to him. He held her, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke and home. The solid, living warmth of her was the only real thing in a world of ghosts and clay. "I told you it would wait," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. Later, inside her small home, she showed him the phoenix. It sat on a small shelf, untouched, its wings still poised for flight. It was a relic from another life. A life of hope and innocence. He picked it up, his calloused fingers tracing the delicate lines he had once sculpted. He had survived. His small, defiant act of creation had outlasted the Emperor's grand army. They did not speak of the necropolis. He could not bring himself to describe the dust, the fear, the shattered face of his brother. That was a tomb he would carry inside him forever. He told her only that the Emperor was dead and that he had walked home. It was enough. In the years that followed, life slowly returned to the land. The brutal Qin dynasty was swept away, and a new dynasty, the Han, rose in its place, promising a gentler rule. Wei and Enli were married. They had children. He returned to his sculpting, but he no longer crafted faces. He made simple, useful things, bowls, pots, roof tiles. His hands found comfort in function, not in effigy. The desire to capture a human soul in clay had left him. He had seen where that ambition led. Sometimes, travelers would bring news from the south. They spoke of the great burning, of the collapse of the pits, of the deliberate smashing of the terracotta soldiers by the rebel armies. They said the entire mausoleum complex, the final resting place of the first emperor, had been looted and then sealed by the new Han rulers, who wanted to bury the memory of the tyrant forever. Wei would listen to these stories in silence. He knew they were sealing his secret along with the emperor's tomb. Deep beneath the earth, under tons of collapsed earth and charred timbers, the remnants of his work lay in darkness. An army of shattered men. And among them, somewhere in the endless debris, were fragments of terracotta with a single, hidden character carved on their inner surface. Wang. Remember. He lived to be an old man. He saw his children grow and have children of their own. He was a grandfather, his face lined with the deep map of a long and difficult life. Enli passed away peacefully in her sleep, and he buried her on the hill overlooking their village, marking the spot with a simple, uncut stone. One evening, in the final years of his life, his eldest granddaughter, a curious girl with eyes as bright as her grandmother's, sat with him as he watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, the colors of the burning necropolis. "Grandfather," she asked, "they say you were once a great sculptor. Why do you no longer make the beautiful statues like the phoenix you made for grandmother?" Wei looked at his gnarled, trembling hands. He thought of the thousands of faces he had known, real and clay. He thought of the proud, shattered face of his brother. He thought of the silence of the sealed tomb. "Some things, little one," he said, his voice a soft, dry rustle like autumn leaves, "are too heavy to be given a face. They are meant only to be remembered in the heart." He knew that deep below the ground, the earth was keeping his secret. The silent, broken army waited. His act of defiance, his prayer for remembrance, was safe in the darkness. It was a secret whispered between him and the earth, a memory that would outlast emperors and dynasties, waiting patiently for the day when men would once again dig wells, and the earth would finally be ready to speak. Story 3. Does a vow have a sound? If it did, it would not be the thunder of a king's decree, shouted from a marble balcony to a cheering throng. It would be the quiet, sharp intake of breath in a room gone suddenly still. It would be the rustle of silk as 100 courtiers shifted their weight, their eyes wide with disbelief. It would be the grating of a stone against a whetstone in a silent barracks, the whisper of a soldier to his comrade, the hiss of a dying fire. In the 2nd century before the Common Era, in the sprawling, dust-choked heart of the Parthian Empire, a vow was made. And it sounded like the whole world holding its breath. The heat in the royal capital of Ctesiphon was a physical thing, a heavy blanket woven from sun and silt and the scent of a million lives pressed together. It seeped through the latticed windows of the palace, clung to the tapestries depicting the triumphs of long-dead kings, and settled in the lungs of those who schemed in its shadowed corridors. In the grand library, where the scrolls of conquered nations lay brittle and silent, Princess Rodogun felt the heat not as an oppression, but as a focusing lens. Outside, the court hummed with gossip, with the delicate dance of influence and favor. Here, there was only the clean, dry scent of papyrus and the stark truths of geography. Her finger, stained with the faint blue of ink, traced a line across a map of the western provinces. The Zagros Mountains rose from the parchment like the spine of a sleeping beast. Her world, the Parthian world, was not a monolith. It was a mosaic of conquered peoples and vassal kings, held together by the iron will of her father, Mithridates I, and the intricate web of oaths, marriages, and, when necessary, fear. It was an empire, as she often thought, built more of duct tape than of marble. And now, a piece of that tape was peeling away. The reports had arrived that morning, carried by a relay of exhausted riders whose horses had dropped dead miles from the city gates. It was a rebellion. Not a peasant uprising over taxes, not a skirmish between rival tribes, but a full-blown insurrection. The cities of Media, rich in horses and men, had risen. Fortresses loyal to the crown had been seized. Royal envoys had been silenced, their bodies left as markers on the road back to the capital. And at its head was a name that made Rodogun's breath catch. Vologases. She remembered him not from maps, but from memory. A Median lord of a minor house, a man with eyes that held the cold fire of a winter sky. Years ago, her father had hosted the western lords to secure their loyalty. Vologases had been there, a young man then, proud and sharp. There had been a slight, a perceived insult over seating arrangements, a dismissive word from Mithridates. Rodogun, a girl at the time, had seen the flicker of humiliation in his eyes before he had masked it with a courtier's smile. It was a look she had never forgotten. A debt, she realized now, that had been gathering interest in the high, cold mountains of his homeland. He is clever, she murmured to the silent scrolls. And patient. The library doors swung open, breaking the stillness. It was Pacorus, her younger brother's chamberlain, his face slick with sweat and panic. Your Highness. The king summons you. The council is in chaos. Rodogun did not hurry. She carefully rolled the map of Media and placed it back in its cylindrical clay holder. Chaos was a tool. You did not run from it, you learned to wield it. As she walked through the corridors, the palace's familiar sound seemed amplified, the whisper of silk slippers on stone, the distant clang of the blacksmiths in the royal armory, the nervous laughter of a handmaiden. It was the sound of an empire holding its nerve. The council chamber was a cavern of tension. Her brother, Phraates II, sat on the ivory throne, a young man whose crown felt heavier than his head. He was a good man, but his reign was new, his authority still hardening. Around him were the pillars of the state, generals with sun-cracked faces and scars that told stories, priests of the sun god whose robes smelled of incense and influence, and the ministers, the men who truly ran the empire with their ledgers and laws. Chief among them was Artaban, the Grand Vizier. He was a man who looked as if he had been carved from petrified wood, his face a mask of wrinkles and serene disdain. He had served her father and saw Rodogun not as a princess, but as a dangerous anomaly. A woman who preferred strategy scrolls to silk pillows, who could ride as well as any man, and whose mind was, he feared, sharper than her brother's. A measured response is required, Artaban was saying. His voice a dry rasp. This Vologases is a provincial peacock. He struts and squawks. Send General Surina with a legion. Offer pardons. A show of force, followed by a show of mercy. The rebellion will collapse upon itself. Rodogun stepped into the chamber, and the men fell silent. They looked at her as if she were a strange bird that had flown into their cage. She wore a simple, unadorned tunic. Her dark hair braided tightly back, her hands free of jewels. She looked not like a princess, but like a problem. "You are wrong, Lord Artaban," she said, her voice clear and steady. It cut through the heat and the tension like a shard of ice. "Vologases is not a peacock. He is a wolf. He has waited years for this. He has the loyalty of the Median clans and the wealth of Ecbatana. A single legion will be swallowed by the mountains. Pardons will be seen as weakness." Artaban's eyes narrowed. "And what does the princess propose? That we empty the capital of its defenses for a mountain squabble?" "I propose that we treat a disease before it consumes the body," Rodogun countered, moving to the great table in the center of the room. "Vologases has taken 3 major fortresses in a month. He controls the road to the east. This is not a squabble. It is a declaration of war. He must be crushed. Swiftly. Utterly." A general grunted in agreement. "She speaks truth." A slow response gives him time to fortify. Phraeates looked from his sister to his vizier, his expression torn. "Lord Artaban's counsel is wise. He has served our father." "My father would not have hesitated," Rodogun interrupted, her gaze locking with Artaban's. The vizier's face was impassive, but she saw the flicker of animosity in his dark eyes. He was using this crisis, she knew, to marginalize her, to push her back into the gilded cage of the women's quarters. "The command of the army is a matter for experienced men," Artaban said smoothly, a dismissal disguised as wisdom. "We shall send Serena, with our full confidence." A hush fell over the room. This was the moment. The pivot upon which her future, and perhaps the future of the empire, would turn. Rodogun had spent her life preparing for moments like this, learning the intricate dance of power. She knew that to win, she could not simply offer a better argument. She had to offer a better story. She took a slow breath and walked to the center of the chamber, her shadow long in the lamplight. "Then I shall lead them," she said. The silence that followed was absolute. Profound. It was as if the air had been stolen from the room. Generals stared, priests clutched their holy symbols, and Phraeates' mouth fell slightly open. Artaban's mask of serenity finally cracked, a fissure of pure shock splitting his composure. "That is absurd," he finally sputtered. "A woman, commanding an army? It is against all tradition. Is it tradition for a Parthian princess to learn the sword? To ride with the hunt? To study the tactics of Alexander and the Scythians?" Rodogun shot back. "Our traditions are what make us strong, my lord. And our strongest tradition is survival. Vologases knows me. He knows my father's line. When he sees my banner, he will see the full might of the empire, not a hired general. He will see the crown itself coming for him. It is a folly." Artaban insisted, appealing to the king. "Your Majesty, this cannot be allowed. It would make us a laughingstock." Rodogun knew she needed more. She needed something that would bind the soldiers to her, something that would turn this mad proposal into a sacred duty. An idea, cold and sharp, formed in her mind. It was a terrible, beautiful, and powerful thing. She turned from the council and walked out of the chamber, not waiting for a reply. The stunned men watched her go. She did not return to the library or to her chambers. She walked straight to the great courtyard of the Temple of the Sun, where the sacred fires burned and the off-duty soldiers gathered to trade stories and sharpen their blades. As she entered, the soldiers fell silent, surprised to see the princess in this dusty, masculine space. She walked to the edge of the central fire pit, the flames casting a flickering, golden light on her determined face. She reached up and, with a single, decisive motion, unbraided her hair. It fell around her shoulders, a cascade of dark silk, shimmering in the firelight. It was her one vanity, her one concession to the beauty expected of her station. Then she spoke, her voice ringing out across the courtyard, clear and resonant, a voice meant to command. "Soldiers of Parthia. A rebellion festers in the west. A traitor named Vologases seeks to tear this empire asunder." A low murmur went through the crowd. The council debates, she continued, her voice rising with passion. They speak of caution. But I say this, caution is the luxury of a lasting peace, and we are at war. I will lead you to Media. I will lead you to the gates of Ecbatana. And I will not fail. She held their gaze. One man at a time, letting her promise settle in their hearts. Then, she made her vow. And I swear this before the sacred fire and by the spirit of my father, Mithridates the Great. She gathered a fistful of her long, dark hair. I will not wash this hair. I will not comb it. I will not bind it in silk or adorn it with jewels. It will gather the dust of the campaign and the grime of the battlefield. It will be my crown of war. And it will not be cleansed until Vologases is brought to his knees and his rebellion is nothing but ash on the wind. A collective gasp went through the courtyard. It was a vow of profound and shocking symbolism. To neglect one's hair was to neglect one's dignity, one's purity, one's self. She was tying her very honor to the outcome of the war. For a long moment, there was only the crackle of the fire. Then, a single veteran soldier, his face a roadmap of old scars, knelt. I will follow you, princess, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Then another knelt. And another. Within a minute, the entire courtyard was a sea of kneeling soldiers, their heads bowed not to a princess, but to a commander. They had not just heard a vow, they had witnessed the birth of a legend. From the shadows of a nearby archway, Artaban watched, his face ashen. He had tried to put her in a cage. Instead, she had just turned the entire empire into her army. The war for Media had begun. And it had started not with the clash of steel, but with the unbraiding of a woman's hair. The journey eastward from the capital was a slow, inexorable crawl out of the silken heart of the empire and into its hardened, sun-baked flesh. For Rodogun, each league covered was a shedding of a skin. The soft air of the palace, thick with perfume and intrigue, was replaced by the thin, sharp wind of the plains, carrying the scent of dust and wild thyme. Her ornate litter, a symbol of her station, was abandoned on the second day. She rode a wiry, black warhorse, its temperament as fiery and stubborn as her own. Her second-in-command was General Surina. A man whose loyalty to her father had been absolute and whose loyalty to the new regime was still being tested. He was a veteran of a dozen campaigns, his face a leathery mask from which two shrewd eyes watched everything. He had been one of the silent ones in the council chamber, his expression unreadable. For the first week, he rode beside her, speaking only when necessary, his posture stiff with professional skepticism. He saw a princess in armor, an untested noblewoman playing a dangerous game. Rodogun knew his thoughts. She did not try to win him with words or with reminders of her lineage. She won him with work. She rose before the sun, studying the maps with the scouts, her questions sharp and insightful. She inspected the supply lines, calculating rations of grain and water with a quartermaster's precision. She walked the camp at night, speaking to the soldiers not as a commander to her subordinates, but as a fellow traveler on a hard road. She learned their names, the names of their villages, the number of their children. And there was the matter of her hair. At first, it was merely a curiosity. The soldiers would glance at it, a dark river flowing unkempt over the collar of her bronze cuirass. But as the days turned into weeks, as the dust of the trail settled into its strands, it began to transform. It lost its sheen, tangling into knots that she refused to touch. It became a living testament to her vow, a constant, visible reminder of their shared purpose. They were not just marching to war, they were marching alongside a sacred oath. Their first real test came in the foothills of the Zagros. A scouting party led by Vologases' lieutenant lay in ambush in a narrow pass. It was a classic Parthian trap, the kind they themselves had used to decimate Roman legions. But Rodogun, poring over her maps, had anticipated it. The pass is too obvious, she had told a skeptical Surina the night before. It is where we would lay a trap. Therefore, it is where he will lay one. We will not enter the pass. We will go over it. She dispatched a small, fast-moving contingent of cavalry to feign an advance into the pass, drawing the rebels' attention. Meanwhile, she led the main body of her army on a grueling, night-long climb up the steep ridges, their horses' hooves muffled with cloth. By dawn, they looked down from the heights directly upon the rebels' exposed flank. The attack was devastating. The rebels, caught completely by surprise, were routed. It was a small victory, but a perfect one. As they surveyed the aftermath, Surina rode up beside Rodogun. He looked at the battlefield, then at her, her face streaked with sweat and dust, her hair a wild, tangled mane. "My father once told me that a good commander sees the battlefield in 3 dimensions, Surina said, his voice raspy with awe. "You, princess, see it in 4. You saw not just the space, but the time." It was the first time he had looked at her and seen not a princess, but a general. The change in him rippled through the officer corps. The whispers of doubt were replaced by murmurs of respect. They had a commander who could think like the enemy. The news of the victory, and of the vow, traveled faster than their army. In the rebel-held cities, it was met with a mixture of scorn and unease. In his provisional court in the ancient city of Ecbatana, Vologases listened to the reports with a sneer. He sat on a hastily assembled throne in the city's old citadel, surrounded by Median lords who had gambled their fortunes on his cause. He was a handsome man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a charisma that could ignite a crowd. He saw himself as a freedom fighter, a liberator freeing Media from the yoke of a distant, decadent Parthian court. "So the little princess plays at war," he said to his council, a laugh booming from his chest. "She and her unwashed hair. What is this, a child's tantrum? Does she think to frighten us with grime?" His lords laughed with him, but some of the laughter was brittle. An older lord, a man named Phraates the Elder who had seen Mithridates' campaigns, was not smiling. "Do not underestimate her, my lord," Phraates warned. "She is Mithridates' blood. And this vow, it is not a tantrum. It is a symbol. It tells her soldiers that she is one of them, that she suffers as they suffer. It is a powerful magic." "Magic?" Vologases scoffed. "I believe in steel and stone, old man. Ecbatana has the strongest walls in the west. We have supplies to last a year. Let her come. Let her sit in the dust and let her hair rot. We will be comfortable within our walls. Winter will break her army, not our resolve." He was confident. He had planned this rebellion for a decade. He had the loyalty of the people, the strength of the mountains, and the wealth of a great city. He had anticipated a conventional Parthian response, a ponderous army led by a predictable general. He had not anticipated a woman who wielded her own appearance as a weapon. He saw her vow as a sign of feminine hysteria, a tactical error that made her an object of ridicule. It was a fatal miscalculation, born of arrogance and a profound misunderstanding of the woman who was now riding relentlessly toward his gates. As Rodogun's army drew closer to Ecbatana, her legend grew. Her own soldiers began to call her the dust-crowned queen. They saw her not washing at the river with the others, her hair growing thicker and more matted by the day, filled with the dust and sweat of their shared journey. It became a point of pride for them. Their commander was tougher than any perfumed lord from the capital. Her filth was a badge of their collective honor. To her enemies, the stories were darker. The rebels guarding the outer watchtowers saw her through their spyglasses, a distant figure on a black horse, her hair a wild, chaotic mass. They started calling her the Witch Queen. They whispered that she practiced strange rites, that she did not sleep, that her unkempt hair gave her unnatural power. The vow, intended to inspire her own men, was proving to be an even more effective weapon of terror against the enemy. She was no longer just a princess or a general. She was becoming a myth. A furious, unwashed woman riding straight for their gates with an army that revered her and a legend that unnerved them. And she had no time for comfort, for mercy, or for conditioner. The siege of Ecbatana began not with a crash, but with a silence. Rodogun's army did not storm the walls. They surrounded the city, a patient, disciplined ring of steel and leather, and began to wait. They cut off the trade routes. They diverted the streams that fed the city's reservoirs. They captured farmers who tried to smuggle grain through the lines. Vologases had prepared for a battle of swords. Rodogun had given him a battle of time. She was weaponizing starvation, and all the while, she camped outside the city with her soldiers, just another commander beneath a canvas tent, her hair growing more terrifying with each passing week. The strands had begun to knot into ropes, and inside the city, the whispers grew louder. The witch queen was outside, and she was not leaving until she had his head. The sun was a merciless hammer over Ecbatana. Within the city's formidable walls, a different kind of war was being fought. It was a war of whispers, of dwindling grain sacks, and of cracking morale. Vologases had promised his people a swift victory, a glorious new Median kingdom free from Parthian overlords. Instead, he had given them a siege. He would stand on the highest parapet of the citadel, watching Rodogun's camp. It was an infuriatingly patient encampment. There were no grand preparations for an assault, no battering rams being constructed. There was only the slow, grinding routine of a professional army settling in for a long winter. He could see the smoke from their cook fires, smell the scent of their roasting meat on the wind, a cruel torture to the hungry bellies in his city. And sometimes, he would see her. A distant figure, instantly recognizable by the wild silhouette of her hair. She would ride the perimeter, inspecting her own siege lines, a silent, relentless predator circling its prey. His spies, the few who managed to slip out and back in, brought tales that only fueled the growing dread. "She shares the soldiers' rations, my lord," one reported, his voice trembling. "Black bread and sour wine. She sleeps on the ground. They say she speaks to the spirits of the dust, and that is why her hair holds so much of it." Fools' tales. Vologases would roar. But the tales spread like a plague through the city's narrow streets. The people, who had once hailed him as a liberator, now looked at him with hollow, accusing eyes. Their children were growing thin. The price of a loaf of bread was now a silver coin. "She is not fighting us with swords," Phraates the elder told him one night, his old voice heavy with grim certainty. "She is fighting us with our own hunger. She is letting us rot from the inside out." Vologases, driven by frustration and the growing murmurs of dissent among his own lords, decided he had to break the stalemate. He would show his people that he was still a warrior, not a cornered rat. He planned a sortie, a bold, surprise attack on a section of the siege line he perceived as weak. He would lead it himself. It was exactly what Rodogun had been waiting for. Her own spies within the city had informed her of the growing desperation. For weeks, Surina had urged a direct assault. "The walls are high, but our men have spirit," the old general had argued. "A soldier's spirit is a precious resource, General," Rodogun had countered, her voice calm. "We will not spend it cracking stone. We will let Vologases spend his own. A desperate man is a predictable man. He will grow tired of waiting for me to attack, so he will attack me instead. And he will do it where he thinks we are weakest." She had deliberately left one sector of her camp looking less fortified, the tents more scattered, the patrols less frequent. It was a perfectly baited hook. When Vologases and his elite cavalry thundered out of the city gates under the cover of a moonless night, they met with initial success, crashing through the outer ring of sentries. A cheer went up from the city walls. But their triumphant charge quickly turned into a slaughter. From the darkness on both flanks, Rodogun's heavy cavalry, who had been lying in wait, smashed into them. It was not a battle, it was an annihilation. Vologases fought like a cornered lion, but he was forced into a humiliating retreat, leaving half of his best men dead or dying on the plain. He stumbled back through the gates, his armor dented. His pride shattered, to the stunned silence of his people. He had not broken the siege, he had only tightened its hold on their souls. The failed sortie was the breaking point. The whispers in Ecbatana turned into open dissent. The city lords who had backed him now saw only ruin. Food riots broke out in the marketplace. Volagases, paranoid and furious, began executing anyone suspected of disloyalty. But his brutality only deepened the cracks in his authority. Meanwhile, Rodogan's legend took on a new, terrifying dimension. She had not only predicted his move, she had turned it against him with chilling precision. To the people of Ecbatana, she was no longer just a witch, she was a seer, a strategist whose mind they could not comprehend. The end came not from the main gates, but from a small postern door near the city's waste tunnels. It was a forgotten gate, used only by the lowest servants, left with a single, exhausted guard. Perhaps the guard had been bribed. Perhaps he had simply fallen asleep from hunger. A small team of Rodogan scouts, disguised as beggars, found it. That night, under the cover of a howling wind that masked all sound, 100 of Rodogan's best warriors slipped through the gate. They moved like ghosts through the sleeping city, killing the sentries at the main gatehouse and lowering the great drawbridge. Rodogan and Surina, waiting with the bulk of their army, did not hesitate. They poured into the city. The fighting was brief and one-sided. The rebel soldiers, demoralized and half-starved, surrendered in droves. Volagases made his last stand in the citadel, but his personal guards, seeing the hopelessness of it all, threw down their weapons. Rodogan found him in the throne room. He was alone, his fine robes torn, his sword lying on the floor. He looked up as she entered, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. He stared at her hair, now a fearsome, matted crown of filth and victory. "The witch queen," he spat, his voice a broken whisper. Rodogan walked toward him, her footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. She carried no weapon. Her hands were empty. "No magic. My lord," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of the entire campaign. "Just discipline. You thought my vow was a weakness. It was my greatest strength. While you were feasting in your palace, my soldiers saw me sharing their dirt. While you demanded loyalty, I earned it. You lost this war the day you laughed at my hair." She did not kill him. Killing him would make him a martyr. She had a more fitting punishment in mind. He would be taken back to Ctesiphon in chains, paraded through the streets, and forced to live out his days as a testament to the cost of treason. His name would become a cautionary tale whispered to children. It was a fate, she knew, worse than death. As the sun rose the next morning, its light fell upon a city that was hers. Her banner, the banner of the Parthian crown, now flew from the highest tower of the citadel. Rodogan stood on the battlements, her face streaked with the ash and sweat of the final assault, and looked out over the conquered city. She was unbathed, victorious, and utterly terrifying. Her vow was complete. Victory was not declared with trumpets or a grand parade. It was declared with water. In the central courtyard of the captured citadel, before her assembled army, Rodogan prepared to fulfill the final part of her oath. Her soldiers, men who had followed her through dust and blood, stood in a vast, silent circle. They were hardened veterans, their faces scarred and sunburned, but they watched the scene before them with the reverence of acolytes in a temple. Servants brought forth large copper basins filled with steaming water, scented with rosemary and lavender. They brought oils, warmed and fragrant, and combs carved from sandalwood that had been kept in a silk-wrapped case for the entire campaign, waiting for this moment like sacred relics. Rodogan stood in the center of the courtyard. She wore the same dented bronze cuirass and leather breeches she had worn in the final assault. She did not look like a princess, she looked like a warrior. Then, slowly, she began to remove her armor, piece by piece, until she stood in a simple linen shift. She knelt before the first basin. For a long moment, she simply stared at her reflection in the water. The face that looked back was a stranger's, thinner, harder, the eyes holding a wisdom that had been bought at a high price. Then, she plunged her hands into the water. She began to wash her hair. It was a long, arduous process. The months of accumulated grime, sweat, and dust had turned the strands into a thick, tangled mat. She worked patiently, her servants helping, pouring clean water over her head, working the fragrant oils through the knots. For the soldiers watching, the ritual was profoundly symbolic. Every tangle undone was a rebel city reclaimed. Every knot worked free was a traitorous lord brought to heel. Every rinse of water that washed the filth from her hair and soaked into the courtyard stones seemed to cleanse the very land of its rebellion. Some of the soldiers wept openly, unashamedly. Others watched in a silence so deep it felt holy. This was not about hygiene. It was about restoration. They were watching their queen, their commander, wash away the war. They were watching her transform back from the witch queen, the mythic creature of the battlefield, into Rodogun, their princess. When it was finally done, her hair lay clean and dark and glistening on her shoulders. She rose to her feet. No crown was placed on her head. She did not need one. The dust had been her diadem. The vow had been her scepter. In that moment, her authority was more absolute than any king's. She did not return to the capital immediately. For another month, she stayed with her troops. She toured the newly secured provinces, ensuring the new loyalist governors were installed fairly. She used the captured rebel treasury to pay her soldiers bonuses and to distribute grain to the towns that had suffered under the siege. She knew that a victory won by the sword must be secured by justice. By the time she finally turned her horse back toward Ctesiphon, her legend had preceded her. It was a legend forged not in gold or silk, but in dust and water, and a promise kept. The return to Ctesiphon was a slow, triumphant procession. In every town and village she passed through, people lined the roads. Not to gawk at a royal parade, but to catch a glimpse of the woman who had become a living legend. They threw flowers not at a princess carried in a litter, but at a commander on a warhorse, her armor still bearing the dents of the campaign, her face browned by the sun. They saw not a distant royal, but the woman who had shared the hardship of the road. Her victory was their victory. But in the marble halls of the capital, her imminent arrival was met with a different kind of awe, the kind reserved for a coming storm. The whispers in the corridors were no longer about the rebellion, but about Rodogun herself. The dust-crowned queen. The woman who had done what no general had been trusted to do. Artaban, the Grand Vizier, felt a cold dread settle in his bones. His plan to marginalize her had backfired spectacularly. He had hoped the campaign would break her, or that she would prove incompetent and return in shame. Instead, she had returned with the loyalty of the entire Western army and the adoration of the common people. She was no longer just a clever princess, she was the most popular figure in the Parthian Empire. She was a threat. What is to be done? He asked King Phraates in a private council. The king, younger and more easily swayed, looked unnerved. She is my sister, Phraates said weakly. She has won a great victory for the crown. She has won a great victory for herself, Artaban corrected, his voice a low hiss. The soldiers do not sing praises of their king, they sing of their warrior princess. They tell tales of her vow, of her cunning. She holds the love of the army in the palm of her hand. That is a dangerous thing, your majesty. A very dangerous thing. Artaban proposed a solution. Marry her off, he urged. To a foreign king, a powerful one. An alliance that will serve the empire and place her far from here, where her influence cannot curdle into ambition. When Rodogun finally entered the city gates, the official welcome was lavish. Trumpets blared. Priests offered blessings. Her brother, the king, embraced her publicly and proclaimed a week of festivities in her honor. But Rodogun, whose senses had been sharpened by the realities of war and siege, saw through the pageantry. She saw the fear in her brother's eyes, the cold calculation in Artaban's smile. She understood that she had just walked from one battlefield into another. This one would be fought not with swords, but with whispers. With glances, with the poisoned honey of courtly praise. They offered her titles, Governor of Media, Supreme Commander of the Western armies. They offered her vast estates, their incomes enough to rival the king's own. She politely refused them all. I served the crown as was my duty, she would say, her voice calm and devoid of triumph. My only reward is the peace of the empire. Her refusal unnerved them more than any demand would have. They could not understand her. What did she want? Rodogun wanted something far more valuable than land or titles. She wanted power. Not the kind that came with a seal and a decree, but the kind that could not be taken away. The kind she had discovered in the dust of the campaign and was now learning to wield in the silence of the court. She attended the meetings of the Grand Council, taking her seat as a princess of the royal blood. But she rarely spoke. She would sit, perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, and listen. Her gaze would move from speaker to speaker, her expression unreadable. Her silence became a weapon. A general would propose a risky campaign on the eastern border. He would lay out his plans, his voice full of confidence, but then his eyes would meet Rodogun's. He would see her still, silent form, and remember the commander who had outthought Volagases. His confidence would waver. He would begin to second-guess his own strategy. Perhaps a more defensive posture is wiser for now, he would stammer. A minister would suggest a heavy new tax on the merchant guilds. As he spoke, he would feel Rodogun's quiet gaze upon him. He would remember that she had won the people's love by distributing grain, not by levying taxes. He would clear his throat. Suddenly nervous. On the other hand, he would amend, the treasury is stable. The guilds are a vital part of our prosperity. Let us reconsider. Her silence was not passive. It was an active, unnerving force. It was filled with the unspoken weight of her accomplishments. Her presence alone forced the men around her to be better, to be smarter, to be more cautious. They were terrified of her disapproval, a disapproval she never even had to voice. Artaban watched this performance with a growing sense of helpless fury. He could not accuse her of treason, she did nothing. He could not accuse her of ambition, she asked for nothing. She was untouchable, a living legend walking the palace halls, her power growing with every word she did not speak. He realized he could not defeat her in the present. So he decided to erase her from the future. As the Grand Vizier, Artaban controlled the royal scribes and the state archives. He began a slow, subtle campaign of historical revisionism. The official chronicles of the Median rebellion were commissioned. In the first drafts, Rodogun's role was central. Artaban would review them, a thoughtful frown on his face. An excellent account, he would tell the chief scribe. But perhaps it gives too much personal credit. A victory belongs to the empire, to the divine will of the gods, and to the wisdom of the king who dispatched the army. It is unseemly to elevate one individual so highly. It diminishes the crown. The scribes, eager to please the vizier, would revise. In the second draft, Rodogun was still the commander, but her strategic brilliance was downplayed. The victory was attributed more to the bravery of the soldiers and the logistical planning of the council. Artaban would review it again. Better. But this matter of the vow, it is a strange, rather unseemly detail, is it not? A bit barbaric. Not fit for the glorious annals of the Parthian state. Let us focus on the martial aspects of the campaign, not a commander's eccentricities. And so, it was removed. Over months and years, the story was sanded down, polished, and reshaped. Rodogun's command was slowly reframed as a nominal, symbolic leadership role. The decisive tactical moves were attributed to General Surina. The final victory was presented as the inevitable result of Parthian might, ordained by King Phraates. Her name was still there, a footnote in her own triumph. Rodogun knew what was happening. She would occasionally request to see the chronicles, and she would read the slow, methodical erasure of her own deeds with a kind of detached irony. She did not protest. She did not argue. She understood that Artaban was fighting a war for the pages of history books. But she knew a secret that he did not. History is not only what is written. It is also what is remembered. While the scribes were diluting her story with ink, her legend was fermenting in the taverns, in the barracks, and around the firesides of the common people. The soldiers who had served under her told the real story. They told of the vow. They told of the dust-crowned queen. They told of her cunning, her courage, her sharing of their hardship. They taught their children the songs they had composed about her. The official history belonged to Artaban and the court. But the memory belonged to the people. And Rodogun knew which of the two would last longer. One evening, years after her victory, a young, ambitious senator, hoping to curry favor, approached her in the palace gardens. "Your Highness," he said with a deep bow. "I have been reading the official account of the Median campaign. A great victory for the empire. General Surina was a masterful tactician. Rodogun was watching the sun set over the Tigris, turning the dusty sky to a blaze of orange and purple. She turned her head slightly, her hair now clean and braided with gold thread, and looked at the young man. She offered him a small, enigmatic smile. "Yes," she said, her voice soft as the evening breeze. "History is full of such masterful men." She then turned back to the sunset, her silence descending once more, leaving the senator feeling foolish and small, as if he had just tried to explain the ocean to the tide itself. She had won the war. She had won the peace. And now, she was content to let the whispers of her legend do the rest of her fighting for her. Decades passed. The world turned. King Phraates too ruled and died, as did his successor. Artaban the vizier grew old, his skin as dry and brittle as the scrolls he had so carefully edited, and eventually, he too crumbled to dust. The Parthian Empire, ever the precarious mosaic, faced new threats, new rebellions, new wars. The Median campaign, once a crisis that had shaken the foundations of the state, became just another chapter in a long and bloody history. And in the official chronicles, Rodogun became what Artaban had intended, a curious footnote. Princess Rodogun, sister of the king, who held a nominal command during the successful suppression of the traitor Vologases. A minor character in a play that was no longer performed. But legends have deeper roots than official histories. They grow in the dark, rich soil of human memory, watered by story and song. In the mountain outposts along the Zagros frontier, when new recruits complained of the harsh conditions, a grizzled veteran would spit in the dust and say, "You think this is hardship? Let me tell you about the dust-crowned queen. She slept on this very ground and did not wash for a year, all to bring a traitor to justice. Her filth was more honorable than your finest silks." The recruits would fall silent, their own small sufferings put into perspective by the shadow of her great one. In the villages of Media, mothers would tell the story of the witch queen to their unruly daughters. It was not a fairy tale meant to soothe, but a cautionary one. "Behave," they would say, "or the woman who tamed Vologases will come for you." But in the telling, the story changed. The fear was replaced by a kind of grudging respect. She had been their conqueror, yes, but she had been just. She had brought grain after the siege. She had not put their city to the torch. She was a hard woman, but an honorable one. And among the women of the Parthian court, her story was a whispered secret, a spark of defiance. When a husband was too dismissive, when a brother claimed all the credit for a shared success, a noble woman might look at her reflection and see, for a fleeting moment, a woman with dust in her hair. Rodogun's life became a quiet testament to the fact that power did not always roar. Sometimes, it simply endured, silent and observant, waiting for its moment. Historians of a later age, poring over the fragmented records of the Parthian dynasty, would be puzzled by her. They would see the official, sanitized accounts and then find contradictory fragments, a line in a soldier's recovered letter, a stanza from a popular song, a reference in a foreign text, that hinted at a much larger, much stranger story. They would debate her motives, her methods, the truth of the vow. Was she a brilliant strategist or a mad zealot? A feminist icon born centuries before her time or a historical anomaly? They could not know that she was all of these things. And none of them. She was simply a woman who understood the tools she had at her disposal. She understood that in a world obsessed with appearance, the most powerful statement was to reject it. In a court that ran on words, the most powerful position was silence. In an empire that celebrated conquerors, the greatest victory was to conquer expectation itself. Rodogun, in her later years, never led an army again. She did not need to. Her one campaign had been enough. She remained in the palace, a figure of immense, unspoken authority. She advised kings, not with speeches, but with a raised eyebrow or a subtle nod. She shaped policy from the shadows, her influence felt but rarely seen. She had become the empire's conscience, its living memory of a time when its survival had rested on a single, audacious vow. Some said she retired from public life entirely, choosing to live out her final years on a quiet country estate, far from the snakes of the court. Others claimed she simply faded, becoming more and more silent until she was little more than a ghost in the palace corridors, a presence felt only by the weight of her legend. Her death, like much of her life, went unrecorded in the grand histories. No grand mausoleum was built in her name. No epic poem was commissioned by the state to sing her praises. Artaban's final, posthumous victory was that her end was quiet, official, and unremarkable. But he had failed to erase the story. Because you cannot erase what has become a part of the land itself. The dust of the Zagros mountains still holds the memory of her passage. The stones of Ecbatana still remember the silence of her siege. The winds that sweep across the plains still whisper the tales told by her soldiers. Her legacy was not in stone or on papyrus. It was in the unshakable truth that a woman with a mission is a force more powerful than an army. It was in the understanding that a vow, even one as strange as refusing to comb one's hair, could be more binding than a royal decree and infinitely more inspiring. It was in the quiet dignity of a victory won not for personal glory, but for the preservation of a home. Centuries after Parthia itself had crumbled and its cities had turned to sand, her name would return, revived by artists who saw in her a symbol of defiance, by writers who searched for her footprint in the dust of the past. They would paint her with wild hair and fire in her eyes, standing victorious over her enemies. They would write of her not as a footnote, but as the entire chapter. She was forgotten by kings, ignored by chroniclers, but she was remembered by the dust. And in the dust, where all empires eventually end, is where legends truly live. Not written, but embodied. Not in stone, but in soil. She had been crowned not with gold, but with history itself, a crown she had earned, worn, and then quietly laid aside, her silence the final, most powerful word in her own extraordinary story. Story 4. Have you ever tasted silence? Not the quiet of a sleeping city or the hush of a library, but the true, absolute silence that presses in on you, heavy as a shroud, thick enough to drink. It is a silence that has a flavor, metallic and cold, like a coin placed on the tongue of the dead. It is the silence of the earth, of being buried alive. Cornelia, of the ancient and noble Cornelii, was about to learn its taste. But before the silence, there was fire. For 24 years, Cornelia's world had been defined by the eternal flame of Vesta, the sacred heart of Rome. Site_start, she was one of 6, a priestess, a Vestal virgin, chosen before the age of 10 to serve the goddess for 30 years, Site, 4, 5, her life was a looping tapestry of ritual and honor. The rhythmic chant of morning prayers, the scent of burning mola salsa, the weight of the pure white stola on her shoulders. Site_start, she was not a woman, she was a living symbol. The spiritual guarantor of the Republic's fortunes, Site, 3, as long as the flame she guarded burned, Rome would stand. Site_start, if it went out, everything would go wrong, Site, 4. Site_start, and if a Vestal's vow of chastity was broken, it was as if a nuke had been detonated in the heart of the Senate, Site, 6. Her days were measured by the sun's march across the marble floor of the Atrium Vesti, the grand house where she lived in privileged seclusion. Site_start, she had front-row seats at the games, the right to travel in a cushioned carriage, and the power to pardon a condemned man with a single glance if their paths crossed, Site, 15. It was a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. 30 years of service. 10 to learn, tend to practice, tend to teach. Then, and only then, would she be free to marry. To live a normal life. By then, she would be nearly 40. A lifetime away. Cornelia had never truly questioned her fate. To be chosen was the highest honor a daughter of Rome could receive. Her blood was sacred, her body a vessel for the city's purity. She accepted the solitude, the endless repetition, the monastic quiet of her existence. She found a strange peace in the discipline, a sense of purpose in the unwavering flame that danced in the heart of the temple. Its light a shield against the chaos of the world outside. The world outside was Rome under Domitian, a city stretched taut with paranoia. The emperor, a man who saw conspiracy in every shadow and insolence in every downcast eye, had become obsessed with moral purification. He saw the old traditions crumbling, the virtues that had built the empire eroding like sandstone in the rain. And he had turned his gaze, with a reformer's zeal, upon the sacred college of the Vestals. 2 had already been condemned during his reign, their names whispered with a mixture of pity and terror. Rome needed to be reminded of the price of piety. Cornelia had pitied those girls, but from a distance. Their fate was a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of the razor's edge upon which she walked. She was diligent, pious, and above all, careful. Her interactions with men were formal and brief, conducted in public, her eyes always modestly lowered. She was, she believed, untouchable. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. It does not announce its arrival with trumpets, it slips in through a side door, disguised as something ordinary. For Cornelia, it was disguised as a book. It was Lucius Vettius who brought it. He was the son of a senator. A young man with a mind as sharp as his profile and eyes that held a startling, unnerving quiet. He was no swaggering soldier or preening politician. He was a student of the Stoics, a lover of Greek poetry. He had come to the temple with his father to make an offering, and while the senator spoke with the Pontifex Maximus, Lucius had noticed Cornelia standing in the peristyle garden, her fingers tracing the veins of an ivy leaf. He had not spoken to her then. It would have been improper. But he had seen her. Really seen her. Not as a symbol, not as a sacred vessel, but as a woman, momentarily lost in thought, her brow furrowed with an intelligence that seemed to waste away in the perfumed air of the temple. A week later, a package arrived, delivered by a trusted servant of the Vettius household. It was a scroll, a copy of Epictetus, with a simple, unsigned note. For a mind that seeks harmony, even in a walled garden. Cornelia should have burned it. She should have reported the gift to the Vestalis Maxima, the chief virgin, and never thought of it again. To accept a gift from a man, a secret gift, was a breach of protocol so severe it bordered on sacrilege. It was a thread, a tiny, insignificant thread, but one that, if pulled, could unravel her entire world. She did not burn it. That night, long after the other Vestals were asleep, Cornelia lay on her simple cot, the scroll held tight in her hands. The flame in the temple, visible from her window, cast a flickering, unsteady light across her small, austere room. For the first time in her life, the sacred fire felt less like a comfort and more like a guard, its light a sleepless eye. She unrolled the scroll. The words were a revelation. A drink of cool water in a life of prescribed, ceremonial wine. Epictetus spoke of freedom, not the freedom to come and go, but the freedom of the mind. The power to control one's own judgment, to remain serene in the face of external chaos, to find a universe within oneself. It was a dangerous idea for a woman whose entire existence was predicated on external control. Lucius had seen the hunger in her. A hunger she had not even known she possessed. A hunger for knowledge, for conversation, for a world beyond the cloistered walls of the atrium. The book was a key, and she had just turned it in the lock. Their meetings began in secret, a dance of breathtaking risk. They never met alone, not at first. Lucius would attend public ceremonies at the temple, and for a few fleeting moments, they would exchange words. Their conversation veiled in philosophical discourse. He would speak of Zeno, and she of the nuances of ritual law. To any observer, it was a young intellectual respectfully questioning a priestess on matters of theology. But beneath the surface, a different language was being spoken. It was in the way his eyes held hers a second too long, in the slight tremor in her voice as she replied. He taught her about the stars. Not as divine portents, but as burning suns and distant worlds, a cosmos of logic and reason. She, in turn, explained the deep, symbolic grammar of her rituals, the ancient fears and hopes encoded in every gesture, every sacrifice. They were two minds from different worlds, finding in each other a reflection of their own hidden longings. The risk was intoxicating. Every stolen conversation, every shared glance, was a spark in the dry tinder of her disciplined life. She felt herself changing. The rituals, once the bedrock of her identity, now felt like a performance. The sacred flame, once a symbol of Rome's eternity, now seemed to mock her own finite, unlived life. She was a fraud, a priestess who performed the rites of purity while her mind was filled with the words of a man. The guilt was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach. But it was overshadowed by the thrill, the terrifying, beautiful thrill of being seen, of being known. One evening, during the festival of Bona Dea, when men were forbidden from the city's sacred spaces, Lucius took the ultimate risk. Disguised in the robes of a female musician, he slipped into the atrium vesti. He found her in the garden, a place that had become their silent meeting ground. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the distant sound of chanting. The moon hung overhead, a sliver of silver in an ink-black sky. When he pulled back his hood, Cornelia's heart stopped. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced through her. This was not a book, not a conversation. This was a desecration. This was death. "You must go," she whispered, her voice shaking. "If you are found." "I had to see you," Lucius said, his voice low and urgent. Away from the crowds. Away from the prying eyes. He did not touch her. He did not need to. His presence alone was a violation, a firebrand tossed into the sanctuary. They stood a few feet apart, the space between them humming with unspoken words, with the weight of their impossible situation. "What you speak of, the freedom of the mind," she said, her voice barely audible. "It is a cruel joke, Lucius. My mind is free to know that my body is a cage. My heart is free to feel what my life forbids." "A cage is only a cage if you accept its walls," he replied, his gaze intense. "The Stoics teach us that we are not our circumstances. We are our choices. My choice was made for me when I was 6 years old," she countered, a bitterness she had never known creeping into her voice. "Rome chose for me. The gods chose for me. And have you never made a choice for yourself, Cornelia?" "Not one?" he asked softly. His question hung in the air, a devastating blow. Reading his book was a choice. Meeting him was a choice. Allowing him to stand here, in the heart of the sanctuary, was a choice. She was not a passive victim of her fate. She was a co-conspirator. In that moment, the years of discipline, of piety, of self-denial, crumbled. The fear remained, a cold serpent coiled around her heart. But something else rose to meet it, a fierce, desperate longing. A longing to live, not as a symbol, but as a woman. To make a choice that was truly her own, no matter the cost. He took a step closer. The scent of the outside world clung to him, of dust, of leather, of man. It was an alien smell in her sterile world, and it was the most intoxicating perfume she had ever known. He reached out, his fingers gently touching the sleeve of her stola. It was the first time a man had touched her, even through layers of cloth, since she was a child. The contact was electric, a jolt that shot through her entire body. It was a touch that would seal her fate. A touch that would condemn her to the waiting silence of the earth. The accusation came a month later. It was delivered by the Pontifex Maximus himself, Tiberianus, a man whose piety was as cold and hard as the marble statues that lined the forum. He was a creature of Domitian, a zealot who saw moral laxity as a cancer in the heart of the Republic. He summoned Cornelia to the Regia, his official residence. The air in the room was cold, smelling of old parchment and the metallic tang of power. Tiberianus sat behind a large wooden desk, his face a mask of stern disapproval. 2 lictors, the ceremonial bodyguards, stood by the door, their faces impassive. "Cornelia. Of the gens Cornelia," he began, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You stand accused of incestum." The word struck her like a physical blow. Incestum. Unchastity. The ultimate sin for a Vestal. Cite_start, it was a death sentence, cite, 6. You have broken your sacred vow. You have polluted the temple. You have endangered the very soul of Rome. Cornelia's mind reeled. How could he know? Had someone seen them? Had the musician girl who smuggled Lucius in betrayed them? Her first instinct was terror, a white-hot panic that threatened to consume her. She could feel the blood drain from her face, her hands turning to ice. But then, through the fear, the words of Epictetus echoed in her mind, *, you are not your circumstances. You are your choices, *. She had made her choices. She would not let them be stripped of their meaning by a craven, sniveling death. She would face this not as a terrified girl, but as a Roman noble. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and met the pontifex's cold gaze. "Who is my accuser?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "That is of no consequence," Tiberianus replied smoothly. "A report has been made. An investigation has been conducted." "An investigation?" Cornelia's voice sharpened with scorn. "You mean spies and whispers. You mean the word of a slave bought with a few coins, or a rival seeking favor with the emperor." A flicker of annoyance crossed Tiberianus's face. He was not accustomed to being challenged, least of all by a woman. "Your indignation is unseemly. And telling. A truly innocent soul would meet such a charge with humble prayer, not with anger." "A truly innocent soul would be believed," she retorted. "But in Domitian's Rome, innocence is no defense. It is merely a prelude to a more tragic end. Tell me, Pontifex, does the emperor truly believe I have betrayed my vow, or does my family's name simply carry less weight than it once did? Is this about piety, or politics?" The lictors shifted uncomfortably. She had overstepped. She had named the unnameable truth, that this was a show trial, a piece of political theater designed to consolidate the emperor's power and terrorize his opponents. Tiberianus's eyes narrowed to slits. "You forget yourself, woman. You are not in a position to ask questions. You are here to confess." "I have nothing to confess," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself. The fear was still there, but it was now alloyed with a defiant rage. They wanted to make an example of her. So be it. She would be an example of courage, not of shame. "The evidence says otherwise," Tiberianus said, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. "We have a witness. A young man. Lucius Vettius. He was apprehended last night. He has confessed. To everything." The world tilted. Lucius. Apprehended. The cold knot of fear in her stomach tightened into a vice. They had him. They had broken him. The thought of Lucius in the hands of Domitian's torturers, his intelligent eyes clouded with pain and his noble spirit shattered, was a pain far sharper than any fear for herself. He would have been promised leniency, promised her life, if he only confessed. A classic, brutal trick. Tiberianus saw the flicker of pain in her eyes and pressed his advantage. "He admitted to meeting you in secret. To giving you forbidden books. He even confessed to entering the atrium on the night of the Bona Dea." Cornelia closed her eyes, fighting back the image of Lucius's face. He had confessed to save her, and in doing so, had damned them both. Her anger turned to a profound, aching sadness. This was the end. There was no escape. But they would not have her tears. They would not have her shame. She opened her eyes, and the fire of her defiance had not been quenched. It had been focused into a single, burning point. The trial was a formality. A piece of grim pageantry held before the College of Pontiffs. Cornelia was brought forth, dressed in her immaculate white robes, a symbol of the very purity she was accused of staining. The chamber was filled with the grim, sanctimonious faces of old men who had long forgotten the meaning of passion, men for whom piety was a weapon and tradition a bludgeon. Lucius was not there. He would have a separate, less ceremonial fate. For him, there would be no sacred rituals, only the brutal efficiency of the public executioner. Cite_start, he would be taken to the forum, stripped, and whipped to death with rods, cite, 13. Cite_start, a brutal, agonizing end, but a quick one, cite, 14. Her sentence would be slower. More theatrical. More Roman. Tiberianus read the charges, his voice droning on, a litany of her alleged sins. Cornelia stood silent, her gaze fixed on a point on the far wall. She did not listen to the words. She listened to the beating of her own heart, a steady, defiant drum against the encroaching silence. She thought of Lucius, of his talk of stars and philosophy. She thought of the single, fleeting touch of his hand on her sleeve. Had it been worth it? Had a few stolen moments of life been worth this? Yes. 1,000 times, yes. When Tiberianus finished, he looked at her, expecting a plea, a confession, a final, desperate appeal for mercy. "Have you anything to say in your defense?" he asked, the question a mere formality. Cornelia raised her head, her eyes sweeping over the assembled priests. Her voice, when it came, was not a whisper of fear, but a clear, ringing challenge that echoed in the silent chamber. "You condemn me for lying with a man," she said. Her voice filled with a cold, divine fury. Cite_start, but no mortal man has touched me. So I ask you, Pontifex, and I ask Caesar himself, she stared directly at Tiberianus, as if he were the emperor, does he think I have lain with a god, then? Cite, 18. A collective gasp went through the room. It was an audacious, blasphemous defense. To suggest a divine union, to compare her situation to the myths of Leda or Danae, was an act of supreme defiance. Cite_start, it was a bold move, cite, 19. Cite_start, it did not work, cite, 19. Her words were met with stony silence. Tiberianus simply nodded to the lictors. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Guilty. Cite_start, the sentence, prescribed by ancient law, to be buried alive, cite, 7. Why buried? Cite_start, because the blood of a Vestal was sacred and could not be spilled, cite. 10, it would offend the gods. Cite_start, so, the Romans, ever masters of the legal loophole, had devised a punishment of exquisite cruelty, a death without blood, without a weapon, a slow suffocation gift wrapped in religious piety, cite, 10, 12. The procession began at dawn. Rome loved a good spectacle, and the condemnation of a Vestal was premier theater. The streets were lined with crowds, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity, pity, and superstitious fear. They did not cheer. They did not jeer. They watched in a kind of horrified silence, as if witnessing a living ghost. Cornelia was no longer dressed in the pure white of a Vestal. She was clad in grim, funereal robes. Her hands were bound. She was placed in a closed litter, a carriage for the dead, and carried through the city she had spent her life protecting with her prayers. She could hear the muffled sounds of the city outside, the rumble of cart wheels, the shouting of vendors, the crying of a baby. The sounds of life, so close and yet a universe away. The litter stopped at the Campus Celeratus, the accursed field, just inside the city walls. Cite_start, here, a small underground chamber had been dug into the earth, a tomb for the living, cite, 11. It was not a pit, but a small, vaulted room, accessed by a ladder. Tiberianus was there, his face impassive as ever. He began the final rites, his voice a low, monotonous chant. Cornelia was led to the edge of the opening. She did not weep. She did not struggle. Her defiance had burned away, leaving behind a cold, clear calm. This was the final act of her play, and she would perform it with the dignity of a Cornelia. She was allowed to descend the ladder herself. The air in the chamber was cold and damp, smelling of freshly turned earth. Site_start, it was tiny, barely large enough to stand in. In one corner, placed with meticulous care, was a small couch, a flickering oil lamp, a single loaf of bread, and a pitcher of water. Site 11. The final, cruel mockery of Roman mercy. They were not executing her, they were merely abandoning her. Providing for her, so that the gods could not claim they had starved one of their priestesses. Site_start, no blood, no mess, no divine tantrums. Site 12. She looked up one last time. She saw the circle of blue sky, framed by the dark earth. She saw the faces of the priests peering down, their features indistinct in the bright light. She did not see Lucius. She did not know if he was already dead, or if he was being forced to watch. She prayed he was dead. She prayed his suffering had been quick. Then, the finality. The sound of stone grating on stone as a heavy slab was pushed over the opening. The sliver of blue sky vanished. The faces disappeared. The sounds of the living world were snuffed out. And then, there was only silence. The blackness was total, absolute. The only light was the small, sputtering flame of the oil lamp, casting huge, dancing shadows on the earthen walls. The silence pressed in on her. A physical weight. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears, the frantic beat of her own heart. She sat on the small couch, her hands still bound before her. She did not touch the bread. She did not touch the water. What was the point? To prolong the agony for a few more hours. Site_start, to lie here in the dark, thinking about her life choices while Rome dusted off its hands and moved on. Site 12. Her life choices. She thought of her childhood, of the pride in her father's eyes when she was chosen. She thought of the years of service, the quiet satisfaction of a duty performed perfectly. Had it been a lie? No. She had served the goddess faithfully, with all her heart. And then she had met Lucius. She thought of his words, of his talk of philosophy. She thought of the secret thrill of their shared knowledge. He had opened a window in her cage, and for a few brief, glorious moments, she had seen the sky. The lamp flickered, its oil running low. The shadows danced more wildly, like frantic spirits. Was this what death was? A small, dark room, with only your memories for company? She was not afraid. The terror had passed, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness. She had lived. She had loved, in her own way. She had felt something real in a life of sterile symbols. She had made a choice that was her own. The flame of the lamp sputtered one last time, a tiny spark of defiance against the overwhelming dark. It shrank, flared, and then died. Now, the blackness was perfect. The silence was complete. Cornelia closed her eyes. She did not think of the gods, or of Rome, or of the emperor. She thought of Lucius's face. Of his quiet smile. She thought of the stars. And as she took her last, slow breath, tasting the cold, metallic flavor of the earth, she found a strange, final harmony. A universe within herself. Story 2. Does a world know when it is about to die? Does the earth tremble? Do the stars shift from their celestial paths? Or does it happen as it did for me, with the scent of jasmine on a warm evening breeze? The familiar weight of a well-bound scroll in my hands, and the sudden, chilling arrival of a messenger, his face a mask of dust and fear. Before the name Alexander was a tremor that shook the foundations of the world, it was merely a whisper from the west, a barbarian's name from a kingdom of goatherds and mountain savages we called Macedon. I was Ariobarzanes, satrap of Media Regiana, and my world was one of order, poetry, and the quiet dignity of 1,000 years of Persian rule. My capital, Regi, nestled at the foot of the Elburz Mountains, was a jewel of civilization. Its libraries held the wisdom of generations, its gardens were a testament to the harmony between man and nature, and its people lived under the benevolent, if distant, watch of the great king, Darius III, may his name be remembered with honor. My father, Phordes, had been satrap before me. He was a man of the old school, his loyalty to the Achaemenid throne as unshakable as the mountains themselves. "We are the pillars of the world, my son," he would tell me, his hand resting on my shoulder as we watched the sun set over the plains. "The King of Kings is the roof. So long as we stand firm, the world has shelter." He taught me to ride, to wield a spear, to read the intricate script of our ancestors, and to understand that our power was not a right, but a sacred duty. He died peacefully, believing the world he had built would stand for another 1,000 years. I inherited his position, his wealth, and his certainty. It was a comfortable inheritance. The first reports of the Macedonian crossing at the Hellespont were treated as a minor annoyance in the grand halls of Susa and Babylon. A young, impetuous king, barely a man, leading an army of paupers. Memnon of Rhodes, our most capable Greek commander, counseled a scorched earth policy, to starve the invaders out. But the satraps of the western provinces, proud and jealous of their lands, refused. They would crush this boy themselves at the Granicus River and send his head to Darius as a trophy. I remember reading the dispatch describing their defeat. I was in my library, the air thick with the scent of aging parchment. The report was clinical, but between the lines, I could feel the shock. The boy king had not fought like a civilized commander, observing from a safe distance. He had led the charge himself, plunging into the river, his white-plumed helmet a beacon of recklessness. He had sought out our commanders and killed them in single combat. He nearly died himself, saved only by the quick action of one of his officers. This was not warfare as we knew it. This was something primal, something terrifyingly personal. Still, the empire was vast. An ocean. What was the loss of a single wave upon its shores? Darius began to muster the grand army, the host of nations, the full might of the Persian Empire. Letters arrived in Regi, demanding levies of men and horses. I fulfilled my duty. I sent our finest cavalry, the pride of our plains, young men I had known since they were boys. I watched them ride west, their banners snapping in the wind, their armor glinting like a river of gold. I prayed for their glorious return. I did not know I was sending them into a memory. Life continued. I oversaw the harvest, settled disputes among landowners, and spent my evenings with the poets and philosophers of my court. We debated the nature of truth, the meaning of the Avesta, the mysteries of the cosmos. The war was a world away. But sometimes, at night, I would find myself staring west, towards the fading light, and a coldness would seep into my bones. The boy king was moving south, along the coast. He was not rushing inland. He was methodical. Patient. He took the Greek cities one by one, sometimes by diplomacy. Sometimes by siege. He was a conqueror, yes, but he was also a politician. He abolished the oligarchies we had supported and installed democracies, winning the hearts of the Greeks. The reports grew more troubling. Then came the news from Issus. It did not arrive via an official dispatch, but through the panicked flight of 1,000 broken men. The story they told was impossible, a fever dream. Darius, the king of kings, the center of the world, had fled. He had turned his royal chariot and fled the field, leaving the army to be slaughtered, and his own mother, wife, and children to be captured by the Macedonian. The world tilted on its axis. The roof my father had spoken of had not just cracked, it had been torn away. The pillars were trembling. At the court in Babylon, where Darius tried to rally the remnants of his power, there was a veneer of defiance, but underneath it was the stench of fear. The nobles whispered in shadowed corners. Some cursed Darius for his cowardice. Others cursed the gods. I said little, but I listened. And I read the reports that trickled in about the conqueror. He had treated the royal family with the utmost respect. He had entered their tent, not as a conqueror entering a prize, but as a guest entering a home. When Sisygambes, the queen mother, had mistaken his taller friend, Hephaestion, for the king, Alexander had not taken offense. He had smiled and said, "You were not mistaken, mother. He too is Alexander." The words echoed in my mind. Who was this man? This barbarian who fought like a demon but showed the grace of a king? He was a contradiction, a puzzle I could not solve. He was a storm, and he was heading for the heart of our world. Darius sent him offers of peace, half the empire, his daughter in marriage, a king's ransom in gold. The reply was as arrogant as it was absolute. Alexander already possessed the lands Darius was offering. He was not a rival to be bargained with. He was the new master. Darius, if he wanted peace, should come to him as a subject. The offer was, of course, refused. Honor demanded it. And so the empire prepared for its final stand. Darius gathered a new army, vaster than the first, on the wide plains of Gaugamela. He chose the ground himself, had it leveled for his scythed chariots. He brought men from every corner of the world, Scythians, Bactrians, Indians with their terrifying war elephants. This time, there would be no mistakes. The sheer weight of numbers would crush the Macedonian upstart. I was given command of a wing of the Median cavalry. On the eve of the battle, I rode through the Persian camp. It was a city of firelight, stretching for miles under the vast, starry sky. The sound was a low hum, a million men and beasts breathing in the dark. It felt invincible. Surely, no force on earth could stand against this. But as I looked across the plain to the small, quiet camp of the Macedonians, I felt that familiar coldness again. They were so few. Their fires were disciplined, contained. There was no fear in that silence. There was only purpose. The morning of the battle dawned hazy and cool. The air was thick with dust and anticipation. I sat on my warhorse, the leather of the reins slick with sweat in my palms. I saw Darius at the center of his line, a magnificent figure in purple and gold, surrounded by his immortals. He was the sun, and we were the rays emanating from him. Then I saw the Macedonians advance. They did not come straight on. They moved obliquely, at an angle, their right wing advancing while their left seemed to hang back. It was a strange, unsettling maneuver. Our commanders, seeing a chance to envelop them, sent our cavalry on the left flank surging forward. I watched as the Scythian horsemen charged. It was a trap. A brilliant, horrifyingly simple trap. As our cavalry surged forward, it created a gap in our own line. A wound. And into that wound, Alexander himself led his companion cavalry, a silver wedge of death aimed directly at the heart of our army, at Darius. I saw the charge. It was not like the clumsy, brawling cavalry actions I was used to. It was a single, fluid entity, moving with a terrifying precision. The King of Kings, who should have been the anchor of our world, became the target. Javelins arced towards his chariot. The fighting around him was desperate, a swirling chaos of men and horses. And then, I saw it. The thing that broke the world forever. The royal chariot, the symbol of Achaemenid power for 2 centuries, hesitated. It stopped its forward momentum. And then, it turned. Slowly at first, then with frantic speed, it turned and fled the battlefield. A gasp went through the ranks around me. A sound of a soul leaving a body. The sun had gone out. The center did not hold. What followed was not a battle, it was a rout. A complete and utter collapse. My own men, seasoned warriors, turned and fled without a command, their only thought to escape the unfolding nightmare. I tried to rally them, screaming myself hoarse, but it was like trying to shout down a flood. Loyalty, discipline, courage, it all dissolved in an instant. All that was left was the instinct to survive. I do not remember much of the retreat. It is a blur of dust, fear, and the screams of dying men. I remember cutting down a Macedonian who had unhorsed one of my kinsmen. I remember the weight of the bodies my horse had to step over. I remember the thirst, a fire in my throat that was hotter than the sun. I found my way back to Regi with a handful of my men, broken specters of the proud horsemen who had ridden out. My city was untouched. My library still smelled of parchment, but the world I had known was gone. It had died on the plains of Gaugamela. Darius had fled east, a king with no kingdom. Alexander was marching on Babylon. The great cities of the empire, Susa, Ecbatana, were opening their gates to him without a fight. A choice lay before me, before every satrap who had survived. We could flee east with Darius, joining him in a hopeless, wandering resistance. We could fight, turning our satrapies into funeral pyres of defiance. Or we could face the storm. I spent days in my library, not reading, but simply sitting in the silence, feeling the weight of my father's legacy. We are the pillars of the world. His words mocked me. The roof was gone. What was the purpose of a pillar with nothing to support? To stand alone in the ruins until it, too, crumbled. One of my advisors, an old Chaldean astronomer named Belshanu, came to me. He had tutored me as a boy. His hands were gnarled with age, but his eyes were as clear as a winter sky. "The heavens do not lie, my lord," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "A new star has appeared in the west. A star of such brightness has not been seen in 500 years. It is a star of conquest and of change. You cannot fight the turning of the heavens. You can only learn to navigate by the new light." His words resonated with a truth I had been avoiding. To fight was to die for a world that was already dead. To flee was to become a ghost, haunting the edges of a world that no longer had a place for me. The only path left was to meet the new master. To see the storm up close. I made my decision. I sent a messenger to Babylon, where Alexander had established his court. My message was simple. I, Ariobarzanes, satrap of Media Regiana, recognized him as the new king of Asia and placed my province and its resources at his disposal. I would await his command. The waiting was the hardest part. Every day, I expected to see a Macedonian cavalry squadron on the horizon, come to arrest me, to execute me and replace me with one of their own. Every night, I slept with a dagger by my bed. But the soldiers never came. Instead, a single rider arrived, a Greek, bearing a scroll with the seal of the conqueror. It was an invitation. Alexander summoned me to his court in Susa. He wished to speak with me. The journey to Susa was a journey through a conquered land. The roads were patrolled by Macedonian soldiers, their strange, guttural Greek a new sound in our ancient land. They were disciplined, efficient, and they looked at us with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. They were the masters now. Susa, the great winter capital, was a city transformed. The air buzzed with a nervous energy. Persian nobles in their traditional robes mingled uneasily with rough-hewn Macedonian officers who laughed too loudly and drank too much wine. It was a city of two worlds, colliding and grinding against each other. I was granted an audience in the Apadana, the grand hall of Darius. The very hall where my father had bowed before the King of Kings. Now, on the throne, sat the man who had shattered our world. Alexander was younger than I expected. He was not tall, but he possessed a physical presence that filled the vast hall. His blonde hair was tousled, his gaze was intense and unsettlingly direct. He did not have the placid, divine detachment of a Persian king. His eyes were alive with a restless, probing intelligence. He wore a simple tunic, not the opulent robes of a Persian monarch, but on his head was the white diadem, the symbol of kingship he had claimed for himself. He did not make me prostrate myself. He gestured for me to approach. I stood before him, the last satrap of a dead king, my heart a cold stone in my chest. He spoke in Greek, which I understood well from my tutors. His voice was clear and carried a natural authority. Ariobarzanes of Regi, he began, his eyes scanning me as if weighing my soul. You were loyal to Darius. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. He was my king, I replied, my voice steady. Loyalty is the highest virtue a man can possess. A flicker of something, respect. Amusement, crossed his face. Indeed. And what is your loyalty to me? You are the master of this land now, I said carefully. My province needs a master. My people need shelter. My father taught me that a satrap's duty is to be a pillar, to support the roof. Darius is gone. You are the roof now. My loyalty is to the preservation of my people and the order of my province. He leaned forward, his gaze intensifying. Order. A good word. But I am not here to simply preserve the old order, satrap. I am here to build a new one. A world where a Greek can learn from a Persian, and a Persian can rise in the service of a Macedonian king. A world where excellence is the only measure of a man, not his place of birth. Can you be loyal to that world? I was stunned. This was not the thinking of a barbarian plunderer. This was the vision of something else. Something new and terrifyingly ambitious. He was not just conquering the world. He was trying to remake it. I can be loyal to excellence, I said, choosing my words with the utmost care. And I can be loyal to a king who respects the customs and abilities of my people. He smiled, a genuine, dazzling smile that transformed his face. Good. Then you shall remain satrap of Regi. You will govern your people as you see fit, according to your laws. You will pay tribute to my treasury. And you will answer to me. In return, my army will protect you. Are these terms acceptable? I bowed my head. They are, great king. Do not call me that, he said sharply. I am Alexander. To my Macedonians, I am their king. To the Greeks, their hegemon. To you, we shall see. I left the audience hall feeling as though I had just walked through fire and emerged unseen. I was still satrap. My people were safe. But I had made a pact with the storm itself. I had sworn loyalty to a man who saw the world not as it was, but as he willed it to be. I did not know if I had saved my province or merely condemned it to a more interesting death. I returned to Regi, but things were different. I was no longer an Achaemenid satrap, a link in an ancient, unbroken chain. I was a governor for a foreign power. I collected taxes for a Macedonian treasury. I sent reports to a Macedonian court. And I began to see the practical application of Alexander's vision. He sent engineers to my province, Greeks with sharp minds and incredible new ideas for irrigation and road building. He sent philosophers who debated with my own scholars, challenging our oldest assumptions. And he sent soldiers, a small garrison to ensure my cooperation. Their commander was a man named Cleon, a tough, pragmatic officer who had fought in every one of Alexander's battles. We were an unlikely pair, the Persian poet-governor and the Macedonian soldier. But we found a grudging respect for one another. He drives us, you know, Cleon said to me one evening, over a cup of strong, unsweetened wine. Drives us like no man has ever driven men before. We've marched further, fought harder, and bled more than any army in history. And for what? For his ambition. His pothos, he used the Greek word, a longing, a yearning for something beyond. Sometimes I think he will not stop until he has marched off the edge of the world. The word sent a chill down my spine. I was tied to this man's yearning. My fate, and the fate of my people, rested on the whims of a king who sought the edge of the world. A few months later, I was summoned again. This time to Persepolis. Alexander had taken the ceremonial heart of the empire, the sacred city of our ancestors, built by Darius the Great and Xerxes. The treasures he had found there were beyond counting, the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of empire. Persepolis was a dream city, a testament to the power and glory of the Achaemenid dynasty. The great hall of 100 columns, the magnificent stairways carved with reliefs of subject nations bringing tribute, it was a symphony in stone. A declaration of our eternal place at the center of the world. Seeing it, even with Macedonian soldiers guarding its gates, filled me with a painful pride. But the atmosphere was tense. The Macedonians, flush with unimaginable wealth and endless wine, were growing arrogant and restless. They strutted through the sacred halls, their drunken laughter echoing in places that should have known only solemn reverence. Alexander himself seemed different. He had begun to wear some elements of Persian dress, a purple tunic, which pleased some of the Persian nobles who had joined his court, but it deeply unsettled his own men. He was attempting to bridge two worlds, but the bridge was fragile, and the chasm below was deep. The tension culminated in a single, horrific night. A banquet was held in the palace of Xerxes. I was there. The wine flowed like a river. The air was thick with smoke from the torches and the boastful shouts of the Macedonian generals. They were celebrating their victory, their conquest of the greatest empire on earth. As the night wore on, the celebration grew wilder. An Athenian courtesan named Thais, the lover of the general Ptolemy, stood up. Her voice, fueled by wine, carried through the hall. She declared that it would be a fitting climax to their victory to burn the very palace of Xerxes, the king who had burned Athens a century and a half before. Let a woman's hand, an Athenian hand, deliver the final vengeance. A drunken roar of approval went up from the Macedonians. I looked at Alexander. Surely, he would not allow this. This was not the act of a visionary king building a new world. This was the vandalism of a drunken mob. His face was flushed with wine, his eyes held a wild, feverish gleam. He was caught up in the moment, in the raw, primal energy of his victorious army. To my horror, he stood, a torch in his hand. He smiled that dazzling, terrifying smile and led the procession out into the night. He was the first to hurl his torch into the magnificent cedarwood tapestries of the palace. I stood frozen, watching as the flames licked at the heart of my civilization. The generals, the soldiers, even some of the courtesans, followed his lead, their drunken laughter mingling with the crackle of the fire. They were destroying 200 years of history in a single night of revelry. They were burning my world to the ground, and their king, the man who had spoken of a union of peoples, was leading them. The heat was intense. The smoke choked the air. The great cedar beams groaned and then crashed to the ground in a shower of sparks. The reliefs of 100 nations, carved with such care, blackened and cracked in the inferno. I felt each falling stone as a blow to my own body. The pillar had crumbled. The roof had fallen. And now the very foundations were being turned to ash. I did not see a visionary that night. I saw a barbarian after all, a boy king playing with a fire far too powerful for him to control. I saw the dark side of his pothose, the destructive impulse that was inextricably linked to his creative genius. He could build a city like Alexandria on one day and burn a monument like Persepolis on the next. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of creation and destruction, and we were all just dust caught in his path. I turned away from the flames. My heart a hollow ache in my chest. The smoke stung my eyes, but the tears that flowed were for more than just the smoke. They were for my father, for Darius, for a world of order and beauty that was now just a fading memory, its ghost ascending to the heavens in a pillar of fire. My loyalty had been to order. I had sworn allegiance to this man, believing he was the new order. But in the light of the burning palace, I saw only chaos. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the journey into the heart of the storm had only just begun. The ashes of Persepolis were still warm when the pursuit of Darius resumed. Or rather, the pursuit of his murderer. Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, had betrayed and killed his king, declaring himself the new Artaxerxes v. Alexander, in a brilliant stroke of political theater, was no longer the conqueror of Darius, but his avenger. He would hunt the usurper to the ends of the earth. And I, his loyal satrap, was to accompany him. This was a new kind of war. We left the familiar, civilized lands of Persia and marched east, into Bactria and Sogdiana, the lands that correspond to modern Afghanistan and beyond. This was a world of soaring, barren mountains and vast, windswept steppes. The people here were as harsh and unforgiving as the land itself. They were fierce, independent warriors who had never truly bowed to the Achaemenid throne, and they certainly had no intention of bowing to a Macedonian. The great set-piece battles were over. Now, we faced a war of ambushes, of raids, of fortresses perched on impossible, sheer cliffs. Alexander's tactics changed. The heavy phalanx was often useless here. He relied on light infantry, on his cavalry, on his own relentless speed and adaptability. He would march his men through terrain that local guides swore was impassable, appearing where the enemy least expected him, a ghost of a commander who moved faster than rumor. Bessus was eventually caught. His own followers betrayed him. I was there when he was brought before Alexander. The conqueror, who had shown such mercy to the family of Darius and the noble Porus in India, showed none to the usurper. Following Persian tradition, not Greek, he ordered Bessus's nose and ears cut off, a punishment for a regicide. The man was then sent to Ecbatana to be publicly executed. Alexander was no longer just a Macedonian king, he was acting as the great king, dispensing the brutal justice of the Achaemenid throne. But the capture of Bessus did not end the war. A new leader arose. A Sogdian nobleman named Spidamenes. He was a master of guerrilla warfare, a phantom who would strike and then melt away into the mountains, bleeding our army dry with 1,000 small cuts. It was during this brutal, grinding campaign that I saw the deepest changes in Alexander. The bright flame of his ambition was beginning to cast darker shadows. The strain of command, the constant danger, the endless marching. It was taking a toll. He grew more suspicious, more prone to sudden, violent rages. The most terrible incident happened in Marikanda, the city you now know as Samarkand. We were at a banquet. The wine, as always, flowed freely. A general, Clitus the Black, a man of Philip's generation, a gruff, honest soldier who had personally saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, became drunk and belligerent. He began to praise Philip, claiming Alexander's achievements were built entirely on his father's foundations. He mocked Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, his talk of divinity. The air grew thick with tension. Alexander's face darkened. He warned Clitus to stop, but the old soldier was too drunk or too angry to listen. He taunted Alexander, calling him a boy who had forgotten his own people. Something in Alexander snapped. With a roar of pure rage, he snatched a spear from a nearby guard. His friends tried to hold him back, but he threw them off. Before anyone could stop him, he lunged forward and ran Clitus through. The silence that followed was more shocking than the act itself. Clitus fell, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. Alexander stood over him, the spear in his hand, his rage suddenly draining away to be replaced by a look of absolute horror. He had killed the man who saved his life. He had killed his friend in a drunken quarrel. He pulled the spear out and tried to turn it on himself, but his bodyguards wrestled it away from him. He was taken to his tent, where he lay for 3 days, refusing all food and water, weeping and calling himself his friend's murderer. He was inconsolable. It was a glimpse into the abyss of his soul, the terrifying conflict between the god-king he wanted to be and the flawed, passionate, violent man he was. This event shook the army to its core. The Macedonians saw their king murder one of his own, one of their most respected veterans. The Persians saw a king who lacked the divine self-control they expected. The bridge between our two worlds seemed on the verge of collapse. It was in the midst of this darkness that Alexander made a move that was either a stroke of political genius or a sign of his growing detachment from his roots. He decided to marry. Not a Macedonian noblewoman, not a Greek princess, but Roxana, the daughter of a captured Sogdian chieftain. She was said to be the most beautiful woman in Asia. I saw her once. She had the fierce, proud beauty of the mountains themselves. To the Macedonians, it was an outrage. Their king, the heir of Heracles and Achilles, marrying a barbarian captive. But I saw the logic in it. He was not just conquering these lands, he was binding them to him. He was creating a new dynasty, a line of kings who would be both Macedonian and Asian. He was making his policy of fusion flesh and blood. He began to formalize his vision. He selected 30,000 young boys from the eastern provinces, the Epigoni, and ordered them to be trained in Macedonian tactics and the Greek language. They were to be the new generation of his army. An army loyal only to him, not to the old traditions of Macedonia. His Macedonian veterans watched this with growing resentment. They had followed him to the edge of the world, and now they saw their own sons being replaced by the sons of their enemies. He also made another attempt to introduce proskynesis, the Persian custom of prostrating oneself before the king. To us Persians, it was a simple sign of respect for the office of the great king. To the Greeks and Macedonians, it was an act of worship reserved for the gods. A philosopher, Callisthenes, the nephew of Alexander's old tutor Aristotle, openly refused. He argued that it was un-Greek, an act of sacrilege. His defiance became a rallying point for the traditionalists. Soon after, a plot was discovered among the royal pages, young sons of Macedonian nobles who served the king personally. Under torture, they confessed to a plan to assassinate him. They also implicated Callisthenes. The evidence was thin, but Alexander's suspicion, fanned by the opposition to his policies, was absolute. The pages were executed, and Callisthenes was thrown into a cage, where he later died. The man who had once championed intellectual debate now silenced it with an iron fist. I watched all this with a growing sense of dread and fascination. I was part of his court now, a trusted administrator. He would often summon me to discuss the governance of the eastern satrapies. He listened intently to my advice on local customs and traditions. He valued my knowledge. In these moments, I could still see the brilliant, curious mind that Aristotle had nurtured. But then I would see him at court, surrounded by Persian eunuchs and fawning courtiers, demanding a level of deference that made his own generals uncomfortable. I would see the flash of anger in his eyes if anyone questioned him. The contradiction was maddening. He was building a world of unparalleled openness and cultural exchange, but he was becoming a tyrant to do it. My own life became a reflection of this contradiction. I was a Persian satrap, but I governed with Macedonian efficiency. I spoke Greek in court and Persian at home. I oversaw the construction of new cities named Alexandria, fortresses of Greek culture in the heart of Asia. I was respected by Alexander, feared by some of my own people who saw me as a collaborator, and watched with suspicion by the Macedonians who saw me as a symbol of their king's foreign affectations. I was a pillar, yes, but I was now supporting a roof that was constantly changing its shape, built of materials that seemed determined to reject each other. The campaigns in the east finally ended. Spitamenes was betrayed and killed by his own allies. The land was, if not pacified, at least subdued. Alexander's gaze turned south, towards the last, great frontier, India. The land of fables, of unimaginable wealth, of philosophers who could levitate and of kings who fought with armies of elephants. For a man driven by pot-hose, it was an irresistible lure. The invasion of India was the campaign that broke the army. Not in battle, but in spirit. We crossed the Hindu Kush, a march through a frozen hell that made the mountains of Sogdiana look like gentle hills. We fought our way through the Swat Valley, taking one mountain fortress after another. The fighting was brutal, the victories costly. And then we came to the Hydaspes River. And to King Porus. Porus was unlike any enemy we had faced. He was a giant of a man, proud and utterly fearless. His army was anchored by war elephants, creatures of myth to most of us, now made terrifyingly real. They were like living siege towers, and the Macedonians, for the first time, felt a genuine fear. Alexander's genius never shone brighter than it did on that day. He crossed a monsoon-swollen river in the dead of night. In a raging thunderstorm. He outmaneuvered Porus, neutralized the elephants with a brilliant combination of tactics, and won a victory that was, perhaps, his masterpiece. He treated Porus with the same magnanimity he had shown Darius's family. When the captured king was brought before him, wounded but unbowed, Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated. As a king, Porus replied. And Alexander, impressed by his courage, not only spared him but restored his kingdom and even added new territories to it. He made Porus his ally. This was the peak. The summit of his achievement as both a general and a king. But after the peak comes the descent. The army marched on, deeper into India. The heat was oppressive. The monsoon rains were relentless, turning the world into a sea of mud. Our armor rusted. Our clothes rotted, and a strange sickness began to thin our ranks. The stories of what lay ahead grew more and more fantastical. We heard of the Ganges, a river wider than the sea. We heard of the Nanda Empire, which could field an army of hundreds of thousands of men and thousands more elephants. The men had had enough. They had followed this man from the shores of Greece to the plains of India. They had conquered the greatest empire in the world. They were rich beyond their wildest dreams. But they were tired. They were homesick. They were old soldiers who wanted to see their families and their farms again. They had reached their limit. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, the last of the 5 great rivers of the Punjab, the army mutinied. It was not a violent uprising. It was a quiet, stubborn refusal. They would go no further. Alexander could not believe it. He harangued them, he pleaded with them, he shamed them. He spoke of glory, of the riches that lay ahead, of the end of the world that was just within their grasp. But for the first time, his words had no effect. He had pushed them too far. He shut himself in his tent for 3 days, just as he had after killing Clitus. But this was not an act of remorse. It was a silent battle of wills. He expected them to relent, to come to him and beg him to lead them on. But they did not. The silence of the army was as resolute as his own. On the 3rd day, he emerged. His face was pale, his eyes defeated. He announced that he had consulted the omens, and they were unfavorable for further advance. It was a transparent fiction, a way for him to save face. But no one cared. A great cry of joy and relief went up from the army. They were going home. Alexander, the man who had bent the world to his will, had been defeated. Not by a Persian king or an Indian army, but by the love of his own men for their homes. His pothose had finally found its limit. The journey back was an odyssey of horror. Instead of taking the known route, Alexander, in a fit of pique and a renewed desire for exploration, decided to sail down the Indus River to the Southern Ocean and then march the army back through the Gadrosian Desert. A wasteland no army had ever survived. It was his greatest mistake. The heat was unimaginable. The sand burned through our boots. The water ran out. Men and animals died by the thousands, their bodies left to be bleached by the unforgiving sun. I saw hardened veterans, men who had faced down scythed chariots and war elephants, weep openly for a sip of foul water. During this death march, Alexander was at his best and his worst. He shared every hardship with his men. He refused to drink the last helmetful of water when his men had none, pouring it into the sand as a sacrifice. He walked with them, his own face cracked and bleeding from the sun and wind. And yet, it was his own stubborn pride that had led us into this hell. I survived. I do not know how. Perhaps Belshazzar was right, my star was tied to his, and it was not yet time for it to be extinguished. We stumbled out of the desert, a ghost of an army, and returned to the heart of Persia. The final year of his life was a whirlwind of activity. He was planning new expeditions, to Arabia, to Africa. He was trying to knit his vast, chaotic empire together. He staged a mass wedding at Susa, where he and 80 of his senior officers took Persian noblewomen as wives. I was among them. He gave me the daughter of a prominent Bactrian lord. A quiet, graceful woman named Ilara. It was a political marriage, another brick in his new world order. But in time, Ilara and I found a quiet affection, a shared understanding of what it meant to survive in the shadow of this great, terrible man. He held a grand celebration at Opus, where he announced his intention to send the old Macedonian veterans home, laden with wealth and honors. But his speech was clumsy. He praised his new Persian soldiers, his epigoni, and the Macedonians took it as an insult. They mutinied again, this time with angry shouts. His reaction was swift and brutal. He pointed into the crowd, picking out the ringleaders, and had them arrested and executed on the spot. Then he delivered the most powerful speech of his life. He did not shout. He spoke to them as a father would to his ungrateful sons. He recounted their entire journey together, from the time they were poor shepherds in Macedonia to now, the masters of Asia. He listed his own wounds, the scars he bore for them. By the end, the entire army was weeping, begging for his forgiveness. He had broken them and remade them, once again. But the fire was dimming. You could see it in his eyes. The endless strain, the wounds, the heavy drinking, they had taken their toll. He had conquered the world, but he had not conquered the frailties of his own body. His dearest friend, Hephaestion, died of a fever in Ecbatana. Alexander's grief was monumental, terrifying in its intensity. He had Hephaestion deified. He ordered a period of mourning throughout the entire empire. He lost all interest in matters of state. A part of him had died with his friend. He returned to Babylon, a city he had intended to make the capital of his new world. It was there, after a long night of drinking, that the fever took him. For days he lingered, his body wasting away, the great army waiting in silence outside the palace gates. His generals gathered around his bed, the men who had conquered the world with him, Ptolemy, Perdiccas, Seleucus. They asked him to whom he left his empire. His last whispered words, they say, were, toi kratistoi star. To the strongest. It was not a succession plan. It was a prophecy of chaos. A challenge. The final, devastating act of a man who had built a world so vast that only he could hold it together. I stood in the courtyard of the palace when the news was announced. Alexander was dead. A low groan went through the assembled soldiers and courtiers, a sound of profound, rudderless loss. The star that Belshanu had seen in the heavens had burned with an impossible brightness, and then, just as quickly, it had gone out. In the days that followed, the chaos began. The generals immediately started arguing, plotting, dividing the world among themselves. The great, unified empire, the bridge between East and West that he had spent his life building, began to crack before he was even cold in his tomb. I returned to Regi with Alara. I was no longer a satrap of Alexander. I was now a subject of a general named Seleucus, who had carved out the eastern portion of the empire for himself. My life would be one of navigating the new wars of succession, of trying to protect my people from the ambitions of lesser men who now fought over the scraps of a giant's feast. I am an old man now. I have outlived them all, Alexander, his generals. The world they fought over. My son, who is half Persian and half Bactrian, and who reads Greek philosophy as easily as he recites the hymns of Zoroaster, will be satrap after me. He is a child of Alexander's new world. Sometimes, I sit in my library, the same library where I first heard the news of a barbarian boy king. I hold a scroll in my hands, and I look out at the mountains. The world did not end. It was simply broken and remade into something new, something strange and vibrant and violent. I was a pillar of the old world. I was forced to become a pillar of the new. I have learned what my old tutor, Belshanu, tried to teach me so long ago. You cannot fight the turning of the heavens. You cannot hold back the storm. You can only learn to build in its wake, using the pieces of the world that was. To create shelter in the world that is. I am Ariobarzanes. I was the last satrap of Persia. I was the first satrap of a dream. And I have survived.